Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Britton's Hangout Hour, episode 105. Still weird that we're in the hundreds, but I am here today with how do you pronounce your name? Is it Serdar?
Serdar is exactly right.
Serdar?
Welcome
Okay,
to the
very good.
1% Club. You're one of the very few who get it right the first time. I'm exaggerating a little bit for effect.
That's good. I'm glad to hear that because I would have felt horrible if I got it wrong.
No
You run the
worries at all.
channel. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce that either.
Yeah,
Infinimata.
Infinimata, exactly right.
Infinimata. Very good. All right, I'm on a roll right now.
Wonderful.
Um, But yeah, you run a YouTube channel. How you doing today, or this
I'm actually
evening?
doing real good. And well, this channel is actually an extension of other work that I do because I'm a self-published science fiction and fantasy author. I've been doing this
Mm.
for a number of years now. The first book that I put out, which I actually had under a different imprint of my own, came out in 2007. And then after a number of years, I basically took my entire imprint and restructured it. I renamed it. I reformatted everything. I chose this new name, Infinimata, because I thought it was a lot more reflective of just the general brand that I was trying to. I had a different branding before that wasn't working at all. And one of the other things that I wanted to do was to find a better vehicle for promotion. And I've noticed a lot of the self promotion for independent publishers and self-publishers has moved to YouTube. There's a lot more conversation and discussion and community there than I would have expected, honestly. And I said, this sounds like something I should do.
Mm.
But I didn't want to just create a channel where I would talk about my books because that's very one-dimensional. And one of the things that I had noticed when I was going through lots of the notes that I'd accumulated on what to do and how to do it, I said, I've got a lot of material in here that I've accumulated over the years that have stemmed from my research projects for my books. And one of the insights that I've taken away is that the vast majority of the really interesting stuff that I've come across when putting together science fiction and fantasy projects
Mm.
has been material that has not come directly from other science fiction and fantasy books. It's stuff that's come from other fiction. It's stuff that's come from nonfiction generally. It's stuff that's come from other research projects. It's come from a place like I like to describe as one step away. That if you're just reading other SF or fantasy as a prerequisite to creating those things, that's not a bad thing because you're essentially doing market research. You're trying to get familiar with what's going on. You're
Mm-hmm.
trying to know the lay of the land, and you're trying to understand what kind of work you're doing and what vein it's going to be in. But if you stop there, you're depriving yourself of a lot of learning experiences.
Yeah,
And
I always tell people to read widely, and some of my favorite writing advice is usually read widely. So yeah.
And so I didn't just want to say read widely because that's a very, that doesn't really tell you what to do exactly. How do I do that? What do I take
Broad.
back from that?
That's a bit
You
broad.
know,
I hear you.
yeah, it's not specific enough. And I said, well, I should pass on some of the stuff that I've picked up about how to do that, where to go, and what to bring back with you. And I've only been on the air, as they say, for a few months now, but I've run down about 30, 35 episodes where I've looked at some of the things that I thought were interesting in this vein, a number of which are kind of left of center or are only just beginning to come into the consciousness of a lot of Western readers or viewers. And I talk about why they would be useful.
Yeah,
Hold on a
that's
second.
what I find interesting about your channel is that you talk about other books that aren't necessarily, or some might argue aren't necessarily, sci-fi or fantasy adjacent, and you talk about how people can learn in order to create good science fiction and fantasy.
Yeah, there's a couple of recent examples that I think are worth citing because these just went up like in the last couple of weeks. One of them is a book by a gentleman named Eric Hoffer called The True Believer,
Mm.
which he wrote in the 1950s in the wake of World War II. And it was an analysis of the mindset of the person or the people who join mass movements. So it was a work of both psychology and sociology.
Mm.
And I had read it once many years before and I'd almost completely forgotten about all the things that were in it. And I said, given the state that we're in right now and how many people are becoming interested in writing science fiction or fantasy that deals with concepts like authoritarianism and fascism and so forth. Why not go back to that and see what it has to say? And I went back to it, and I realized this guy was far, far more on the mark than I would have ever given him credit for. He understood the psychology of what drives people to join mass movements probably better than almost anybody else I've ever read, pardon me.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting. You mentioned that because it seems nowadays there. I mean, and certainly, I'll try and to be very careful with the political talk. But
Oh, sure.
recently in our political sphere, we've definitely had that the mass movement kind of come along, which
And what he
is
does is,
unsettling in
yeah,
some
and
in
he
some ways.
unpacks the psychology of this very well. And I laid out in my talk about it how this could be applied to the kind of work that you might do in a fantasy or a science fiction story. The reason I'm saying both of those labels over and over again is because of something that came up over and over again in a number of the videos that I did, which is how they represent two different worldviews. That
Mm,
fantasy tends to be more about the pre-modern to modern worldview, everything basically up to about the 20th century, maybe a little bit
mm-hmm.
earlier. And science fiction is about from the 20th century forward, because those two worldviews revolve around very different preconceptions. They revolve around very different ideals. They're not constructed the same way at all. And so whenever I talk about something that I've come across, and I try to talk about how it would be appreciated by those two worldviews as a way of being able to say, okay, this is how you could apply that kind of stuff in a fantasy setting, and this is how you could apply that stuff in a science fiction setting. So for something like The True Believer, there's two distinct modes that you could use to do that. Even though a lot of the whole concept of the authoritarian mass movement is a very modern concept, there's a lot of stuff in the book that talks about how that relates to earlier pre-modern movements, mainly around things like religious fanaticism. So
Mm-hmm.
there's room for all of these things to apply somewhere.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I think it's interesting. I mean, you've covered books like Albert Camus' *The Rebel*, which I have not read.
It was a favorite of mine.
I have only read *The Stranger* from him, and some of his philosophical essays, like *The Myth of Sisyphus*. I much prefer him to Sartre. I don't like Sartre. I
Same.
think he's. Yeah, I won't go into that. I've ranted about Sartre before.
Yeah,
Um,
I can see.
uh, I don't really I don't know if you've ever watched any of Joss Whedon's stuff, but I'm like, good lord,
I
what
have.
did you see in this man? Like, I read Nausea, and let me tell you, it was one of the most joyless experiences I've had reading a book, in my opinion anyway. Where I find in something like The Stranger that kind of disconnection feels more, I don't know, it has purpose.
Yeah, when I was looking at The Rebel, which is a favorite of mine, and that was another case of me having read it a long time ago, and then saying to myself, I owe it to myself to come back to it and see how it applies to my current field of discussion. And I reread it all in the space of just a couple of days. I was surprised at how quickly I got through it, given how dense a book it is, because I was just eating up every page. And I again, I saw a lot of ways that this could apply to both a pre-modern setting, because there's a lot of material in it that he talks about from, say, the French Revolution and the Terror, and the experiences of people like the Marquis de Sade. And then, of course, the 20th century with all of its blood and fire. So I
Yeah,
said, there's
who
a
it
lot
was
here
so
for me to.
extreme. Even the revolutionary people were like, "Yeah, we don't know what to do with this guy."
So there's room in that book for there was a lot of material for me to pull out from there to talk about, both the pre-modern, the modern, the postmodern worldviews. They're all beautifully reflected in there. Books like that are kind of rare, though. A lot of times I'll find something that is a little bit more focused. Um, like one of the ones that I looked at recently, very much a modern to postmodern kind of thing, very much a science fiction kind of thing. The book called let me see. I'm looking it up real quickly. I just realized I scrolled past it because I also have my notes on there. The Human Use of Human Beings by
Mm-hmm.
Norbert Wiener. And this was one of the foundational works of the field now known as cybernetics. And
Mm-hmm.
I said, there's probably a lot that has happened in this field to leave this material behind. Reading one of these kind of seminal or progenitor kind of works, it almost seems a little bit crude and primitive. But Weiner was an excellent writer and he was an excellent thinker. And going back to that original material, there's a lot in there that is dated, from a technological standpoint. But in a way, it's refreshing because you're seeing the original core ideas before all of these accruals and all of these preconceptions and misconceptions were laid on top of them. And so for things like talking about artificial intelligence or talking
Mm.
about, the way that we design our artificial environment to respond to us, that's a great work to go back to and to see how these ideas originally took form and how they were originally considered. You pare all these things away, and you see this original nucleus of the idea, and it's really refreshing.
Yeah, I see your video on that book, and artificial intelligence is something that is kind of a recurring interest for me. It's one of my favorite sci-fi tropes, stand-ins, because I am curious if a machine could um, reach the level of intelligence as a human being. And it's a good it's a good concept for sci-fi. They've explored it in all sorts of different ways.
And it's one of these things that just seems like we've only barely scratched the surface of the discussion. One of the
Yeah,
videos that I did,
it's been
that
disheartening, at least for me, seeing how people have reacted to AI. Um, because I feel like we're not really thinking hard enough about it. We're more like, oh, like we're just kind of. It's probably because of the novelty, and also I don't really consider the AI we have now to be technically AI because
right, exactly.
it's not, it's still a machine doing a function. You know, you can't really ask it like, oh, what did you think of this movie, and it could give you like a oh, here's what I thought about it, instead of just giving you information. It just gives you information about it.
It gives you what it's been taught.
Yes.
It gives you a canned response, so to speak. It looks superficially like thought, but it really isn't. It's
Mm-hmm.
just a big blob of math that's acting like it's talking.
Yeah.
This was like that's like the rough analogy that I would use to explain it to my relatives who really don't understand this stuff at all.
Yeah. I mean, and
And
it's
there was actually one of the books that I looked at recently that turned into the single most widely viewed video on my channel to date, which was
mm,
about a book from 1981 or so called Gödel Escher Bach. And it's one of those books that's just almost unclassifiable because it's so fascinating in terms of both its subject matter and its presentation. And the basic idea is that it's a series of interconnected essays about the idea of a mind. What is a mind? What is thinking? Is this something that we can actually reproduce? And the way that the author approaches this is by through all of these oblique angles that at first don't seem to have anything to do with the central subject, but he braids them together over quite a few pages. And I have heard from more people than I can count that this would be like one of the three books that they would take to desert island if they had only three books to take with them. And I did a discussion of it because I said I can't not talk about this if I'm also going to talk about other books about machine intelligence or human thinking as a general subject, and it just exploded. And one of the people that was actually mentioned in the book, who is an illustrator and a calligrapher named Scott Kim, whose work I have followed for many years, he actually came into my comments and said, "Hey, thanks for the review." So I was like,
that's
"Okay, I
awesome.
touched a nerve." And that video ended up also channeling a lot of attention back into the rest of my channel. And I've discovered this is kind of how things work on YouTube. You'll just be puttering along, doing your own thing, and then all of a sudden you do something that touches some nerve somewhere, and you just blow up. And I
Yeah,
said, okay, I must be doing the right thing.
I've definitely noticed that in my own booktube journey, or my own YouTube journey. Is like a lot of it is luck, really. At the end of the day, it's um not really much else to say. It's a lot of it is
It is.
luck.
It's luck, but it's also being willing to experiment and be a little bit adventurous about your subject matter. And I said, when I started doing this, I'm gonna start by following my instincts and my curiosity. I'm not gonna try to force myself to do things in a certain way. The one rule that I did have for myself is I do want to be true to the central concept, which is that I don't just want to talk about stuff at random. Anytime I bring something on for discussion, I want to try to relate it back to my central concern. And if I can't do that, then I'm going to be explicit about it. I'm going to try to keep that to a minimum. I don't like to defocus things. But even with that fairly stern rule, I was still able to come up with some really interesting, in my opinion, stuff to talk about and to relate back. And one of the books that I came across when I was visiting my parents in New York at the end of last year was a book called Fashion Killer, and it's a
Mm.
book about the intersection between the haute couture community and the hip hop community, and how there was all of this interfacing and interrelation between them over the years. And I said, that's a really interesting subject, because you don't really think about how those kinds of things would have that much in common. But it turns out they've had a long and productive and sometimes contentious relationship. And I bought it, and I was just fascinated at the level of research and the energy of the writing and all of the fascinating, anecdotes that come out of a scene like that. And I ended up turning that into a video where I was talking about how you could use this to stimulate thought about how things like stuff at the fringes of your world could stimulate things at the center of it or at the heights of it, and vice versa. And so I said, this is the kind of thing that I want to do more of. I want to dig up these kinds of off-center but fascinating examples and lay them out and say, hey, check this out. This could give you ideas you probably never thought you had.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I mean, one of my big gripes, I mean, with science fiction particularly nowadays, is that we can't really seem to figure out, because a lot of it is either like very idea driven and very dry, or there's what I like to call popcorn science fiction, which is basically like adventure stories with like a vague future element in it. And there's nothing wrong with either of those forms. I mean, I think like I like. Um, I mean, science fiction is called the literature of ideas for a reason. But I always get kind of not frustrated, but kind of disappointed when I don't see a particular balance between like the concept and how people would react to it. But that might be my that might just be expectations or whatever. I don't know.
It's funny because a lot of why I started writing was because I felt some of the same things when I
Mm-hmm.
was much younger. And my older brother, introduced me to science fiction through a couple of what I think were extraordinary exceptions to the rule. And one of them, for instance, was the science fiction author from Poland, Stanislaw Lem, who
Mm-hmm.
quickly turned into one of my favorite writers.
I've wanted
And
to
I was
read
reading
him
him.
for a long time. I
Yeah,
know
there's
I
a
know
probably the best
Solaris.
place to start. Solaris is one good place to start, but my other favorite place to start with him is the Star Diaries, which is essentially a collection of short stories that all involve the same main character. And it's one of those things where there is no two of the stories have the same flavor. Some of them are knock around farce, some of them are deep philosophical speculations, some of them are horror, some are tragedy, some are low comedy, and they all involve things like he takes a lot of basic science fiction pulp trope ideas and invests them with this very European sensibility, for lack of a better word. It's not snooty, it's funny, and it's also highbrow at the same time. And that's a real high wire act. I was reading this and saying, this is, there's nobody else doing anything like this. But when I was young and I was reading that, and I was saying to myself, wow, if SF is like this, then I'm in for a real ride. And then I realized after some more reading that he and a few other authors that I had come into at the beginning of this journey were very much the exceptions to the rule.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt a little let down. And then I said to myself, well, maybe that'll give me something to shoot for. I would love to be able to produce the kind of stuff that I thought I was going to be seeing all along. And that's a tall order to fill, but I love a challenge. So
Yeah, I
it
mean
was sort of
it's.
like Stanislaw. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was interested in Lim because I've heard him be compared to one of my favorite science fiction writers, Philip K. Dick. And if I recall
Ditto.
right, I think PKD even liked Stanislaw Lim,
They did.
even
Yeah,
though
he was. It
he
was. It was actually
also
really funny. They had a whole blow up at each other during the Cold
though
War period.
though if I remember right, he also thought he was like a Russian plant or something, and PKD was kind of
Yeah,
crazy.
yeah.
Uh,
There was a very screwy story about that, but he admired the man's writing, and it
yes.
was very clear they had mutual respect.
And I think even Lim liked PKD's work as well.
He did.
But there's something about PKD's kind of offbeat take on science fiction where it wasn't quite the kind of golden age idea driven type of work, but it wasn't quite like new wave either, where it was kind of like, oh, let's just experiment with all this. And though one could say he is new wave, but I think Philip K. Dick was his own animal.
Very much. I was just reading a book that has been marketed as a quasi-fictional biography of Philip K. Dick called "I Am Alive and You Are Dead."
Huh? I gotta read
Um,
this because I'm always looking for
yeah,
stuff about Philip K. Dick, because his life
it
was
was it was
fascinating.
it was written by a Frenchman who was essentially taking details of Dick's life and turning it into a sort of a novelization of his life and experiences. And so, in terms of its factual accuracy as a biography, I'm not 100% sure how precise it is, but he does a great job of trying to put you in the guy's head and trying to get you to feel what he was feeling or what he believed Dick was feeling through his life.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's the kind of thing that you really want to have as an adjunct to a more formal biography of the man. And also it's not the kind of thing you want to go in cold. You want to have read and experienced some of his work first, or you're going to be completely at sea. But it is worth reading. So Philip K. Dick and Stanislaw Lem, and also you mentioned the New Wave, and there's a couple of figures from there that were also for me
Mm-hmm.
kind of that I thought were going to be examples of everything else that I was going to find, like Samuel Delany.
I want to read.
And
I haven't read him yet. I want to. I've been really bad at keeping up with science fiction the last couple years.
it's tough. There's so much.
Yeah, and there's
It's
also other genres I enjoy that I like.
right.
Fantasy and noir, crime stuff. And horror. And other books. From other people. Um, but I really like. I don't know. This just. I mean, PKD was one of the first people who really did like postmodernism, but he had a unique way of exploring these concepts in very everyday language. And I wish I knew how he did it, because he's
There are
one
a
of.
lot of discussions about how authors or creative artists in general go about their business. And one of the things that I'm leaning more and more towards is that there's a fair number of them who are just not doing this wholly consciously. That there's just some space that they go into in themselves and they just pull the stuff out of there and they don't ask too many questions about it. A lot of it is deeply intuitive.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why if you ask them, you know, highly sophisticated questions, or analytical questions, or critical questions about their work, they're not necessarily going to have the best answers. And I really
Mm-hmm.
feel like Dick was working in that vein, that he was just pulling this stuff out of some really deep emotional and spiritual well within himself, and didn't always know what it meant or why, but he knew that he had to get it out. And that's something I was torn between envying and pitying, because it was very clear the man was just, especially towards the end of his life, he was just helpless in the face of a lot of this stuff.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I haven't dared touch Valis yet, or any of his stuff he did towards the end of his life, because I'm like, that might be too weird even for me. Though
I read those.
I have read A Scanner Darkly, and that's probably, aside from Do Androids Dream, it is my favorite of his so far. Because it's
That
like,
one I bumped into in high school, along with the Valis trilogy, because they were all in my local library.
huh,
And I actually came to, this is gonna, you're gonna die laughing when you hear this. I came to A Scanner Darkly right around the same time I discovered William S. Burroughs and Naked
huh.
Lunch. So they were like practically brothers, spiritually under the skin, in terms of what they saw in their worldview, and in a lot of also their subject matter.
I've only read Junkie from William S. Burroughs, and I really like it. So,
Yeah,
because
I've
I really like dark, grungy, transgressive, stuff about scumbags, and so like Junkie was like, that was great, like give me more of that.
basically I bumped into Naked Lunch in my high school library.
Wow,
Don't
they
ask me
had
how it
that
ended
in
up
your high
there.
school? That is
Yeah, it was in my high
crazy.
school library. I'm not kidding. And they
Oh
saw
no,
me
I don't
reading
think
it.
you're lying. That's
Yeah.
crazy. They
And
had
they saw me
that.
reading it and they took it off the shelf. And I said, I'm not done yet. So I went to the main library in my town, and they had it on the shelf
Mm-hmm.
along with a lot of other stuff from him. And I just picked up where I left off. And I ended up reading pretty much everything that was in print at that point.
Yeah,
and
I've yet to read
he passed away a few
Burroughs's.
years after that.
I haven't read Burroughs's own science fiction trilogy. Was it called The Soft Machine, I think?
Yeah, the books that are loosely described as a trilogy in that vein, they've been described as the cut up trilogy.
Mm.
And the reason they're called that is because they were the product of a series of experiments that he was doing, both by himself and in conjunction with a couple of other writers, where they would take texts and they would basically slice them together, and they would try to produce new meaning from them. And there are many passages of this stuff where it's just basically it's a little bit like reading the wallpaper. It's
Mhm.
bringing up images that don't necessarily make any sense, but over time they begin to produce this atmosphere, and then he starts producing other sections of it that are a little more coherent, and that turn this atmosphere into a kind of storytelling. They're really not easy reading, and Naked
That's what
Lunch
I've
is
heard.
like a precursor to all of this too, because it was also made up of a bunch of vignettes that aren't necessarily connected to each other, but together they make up this bizarre whole. And I really liked I liked his adventurism, and I liked the way that what he was doing was so personal and so singular, that he was not molding himself consciously in the vein of anybody else that was recognizable, or when he did, it was at such distance that you would never have made the connection. And I always said to myself, if you're going to do anything, it's always going to be best if it's something that is something that you entirely bring to the table, not something where you go out and look at what other people are doing and say, oh, I could do that, because that's the easiest thing in the world. But at the same time, all you're really doing is just copying the outside of something. You have to bring
Yeah.
something of yourself to the table.
Yeah, I mean it's a I mean, I how do I put this? But yeah, it seems like we haven't been able, or at least in like modern science fiction, I feel like we haven't really found that balance between like concept and how people would react to that concept. And like, don't get me wrong, there's some like more cerebral science fiction I like, like Childhood's End and I Robot. Though I mean, I guess you could say I Robot has I Robot's its own beast. Um, or again, it's kind of what I call like popcorn science fiction, like Ready Player One is the one I like to pick on a lot. I just
It's an easy target.
yeah.
And it's one of those things that you can talk hate about all day long, and nobody's going to change their mind, because if they like it, they like it.
I don't hate it. It's just kind of
Yeah.
like it. I just find it really disappointing because I'm like, man, there's something you could have done here and you just didn't do it, Because I guess that just wasn't what he was interested in doing. So
Yeah, I mean, everybody's going to be motivated for a different reason. Some people just want to be entertainers, and I honestly don't have a problem with that at all. What I want to do whenever I can is to introduce people to possibilities and to ways of doing things that are going to be able to give them a little bit more to work with. Because if you look at what is possible in the bigger picture, um, you often see things you might never have encountered. Like one of the writers that I am trying to talk more about, and I just recently did a video about some of his movies, is an African author, a guy named Osman Sembène.
I don't think I've
And
heard of
his
this
work
guy.
was, yeah, his work was in English for some time and then fell out of print, and it's coming back in print now. And the same thing with his films, which were unavailable, and now they're being gradually restored and remastered and re-released. Thank you, Criterion Collection. And what I point to him at, first of all, he's a great writer and a great artist, and he's also using the thing that he has to bring to the table, his experience with his native country, Senegal. And a lot of what he gets out of that is the experiences of that country in three different phases: the pre-colonial, the colonial, and the post-colonial. And think about how much SF and fantasy we have going on now that draws on things like colonial and post-colonial uh, life. And we want to know what lies beyond that, or how those things can influence the
Yeah, I'm
existence.
always I'm always kind of picky with like post colonial or stuff about the stuff about that experience because like if it's done wrong, it could come off as whingy, which is kind of sad to say, but um, you know,
But I point to him as an example of how to do it right, because he's from that environment, he's lived it,
mm-hmm,
and this is something that he was making for his own people, not for some hypothetical outside audience.
mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really important distinction. So you come to him, and you do have to do a little bit of homework, to understand the full context of what he's presenting you, but it's not that hard. And so much of what I like to dig up tends to be in that vein. It's something that has something to it that is, you have to do a little bit of work to approach it, but it's worth it, and it's really not that hard. And it forces you to be a bit more of a student of
Mm.
whatever it is that you're looking into, instead of just a tourist. And I made that distinction. Um, I don't think I've actually made that distinction or talked about the distinction in the videos I've done yet. At some point, I'm going to circle back to probably do something more formal about it. But I know that I've talked about it in conversation with other people when we talk about, okay, what if I want to talk about this culture? What if I want to talk about that period of time? And then, you want to be a student, not a tourist. You want to actually sit down, do your homework, and think about it from the point of view that you're presenting, and how that is going to have assumptions that you are not necessarily going to be able to have by default, and vice versa. I
Yeah,
was
like
talking about the whole postmodern versus modern versus pre-modern thing.
I suppose I find it, maybe I'm just not looking in the right place, but I'm always looking for a science fiction story that's as engaging intellectually as much as it could be satisfying emotionally and artistically, because I find there's some people who get, who get lost on one end or the other. Like I read Ted Chiang's Story of Your Life, and the first collection he did, and a lot of people were like, "Oh man, this is great stuff," and I just thought it was fine. There were some good stories in there, like Story of Your Life, and Hell is the Absence of God. But the rest of them, I was kind of like, yeah, these are fine. I don't really see what's like the big deal about this. It's no Jeff Vandermeer, at least in my opinion.
Jeff Vandermeer is another one of those folks. I was like, whenever somebody comes to me and tells me about Jeff Vandermeer, I say, okay, but have you read Brothers Strugatsky? Because that seems to be where he got all his ideas.
I
Because
have read Roadside Picnic, and it is
right
one
there
of
you
the
go.
rare. This might be a shock to some people who are hardcore sci-fi buffs, but I actually might like the film Stalker more than Roadside Picnic.
It's usually I get the opposite response, because
It's interesting.
I love Tarkovsky's stuff, but I know that he's not to everybody's taste. I love that thing where you slow everything down and you just sit and watch,
It's
and
I've heard it be called, because I watched a analysis video about 2001: A Space Odyssey, which infamously pissed Tarkovsky off to the point where he made his own science fiction films.
right.
But I've heard it be called a cinematic hypnotism, and that's how I would describe Tarkovsky's stuff.
Yeah,
At
it
least I've
takes
only
a
seen
certain
Stalker.
nerve to be that patient.
I haven't seen any of his other films. I've only seen Stalker, and I watched it. I turned all my stuff off, and I ended up watching it, and I was entranced personally.
I love the fact that all of his stuff, um, at least certainly Stalker and a couple of others that I know of, they're all available on YouTube for free legitimately.
Oh, are they? Oh,
Yes,
I have
because
the
they were
Criterion.
most of them were produced in the Soviet Union, and so basically the government owns the film, so they have the right to stream it. But
I have
the
the Criterion edition of Stalker. I got it for Christmas, and then I
awesome.
watched it because a bunch of people were like, "Oh man, Britton, you should watch Stalker." And I'm like, you know what? Maybe I should watch some more international cinema. I'm kind of getting tired of of American cinema, to be honest
This is
with
where
you.
I came in originally. Is that I was raised on a lot of stuff that wasn't necessarily in English by default, both movies and books.
Mm.
And I started to see enormous differences from early on, not just in terms of the subject material, but also in the ways that they were cultivated and presented and passed across generations. And you get very, very different kinds of stories, very different kinds of storytelling, very different sets of presumptions. And I realize that there are a fair number of people who want to do things that are leaping and straining at the leash of the imagination, and yet at the same time, they're not getting far enough outside of their existing circle of assumptions
Hmm.
to really snap that leash. So whenever I can find stuff that I think helps with that, as even if it's just a way of saying, "Hey, look what else is possible,"
Yeah, I mean,
then I try to dig that up and present it.
I'm not a complete philistine. There are some foreign movies I like, such as like Ikuru from um, Akira Kurosawa, and
Oh yeah,
Ron, also from Akira Kurosawa.
that's probably one of my favorites of all time. Yeah.
Um, freaking love Ron. I remember I watched it when I was a kid because I was a big battle scene nut when I was a kid. Still am a pretty big battle scene nut, and the battles in Ron were just awesome. I
I
loved them.
credit that movie with probably having the single biggest impact on my life up to that point, even bigger than Star Wars, which I saw in the theater when it first came out
Oh
in
wow.
1977 as a 5-year-old. That was quite an experience. And then over the next several years, the next two Star Wars movies came out, and this was what was in my head. And then in 1985, when I was 13, my mother came to me and said, a friend of mine was going to go with me to see this movie, but she dropped out. Do you want to come with me? And that was Kurosawa's Ron, which was just then playing in
Wow,
theaters
that
and
must have
playing
been
on the Walter
awesome to see
Reed.
that on the big
Yeah,
screen.
the single biggest screen in New York City at the time. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I was dazed. And that was also where my interest in Japan as a subject also began. This was, years and years and years before anime and manga became a thing in the US.
Yeah,
So by
no,
the time that
it's
finally exploded, I already had some precursor, so to
yeah, like
speak.
I watched Akuru like a few years ago and I was like, "My god, this movie is absolutely incredible." Um, you know, it's I mean, I don't really know what else to say about that film, but I loved it when I saw it. I
Yeah.
was admitted a little jarred when he does, spoilers for Akuru for anyone who hasn't seen it, when he
Ah,
does die and it's at the funeral, because I thought the movie would be like him you know, kind of grappling with his last, days on Earth. But then we see it from like a flashback. It's really it's I thought
yeah,
that was kind of
they show the
jarring.
funeral, and then they show everyone else's responses in the funeral to all the other things that he did right up to his death. And I read this great essay by Roger Ebert where he
Mm,
talks about this strategy, and he says this is the strategy that the director is using to turn things around and put them on you, to get you to feel like you want to evangelize for his sake. It makes you want to push against the ignorance and the selfishness of all the people who are surviving him.
mm-hmm.
And it's a really daring gambit, but it pays off.
I agree.
And
Yeah,
and this
because
was this was also one of those things where I was really struggling with it because I said, I would love to talk about stuff like that on my channel all day long. The problem is there are so many other people doing exactly that. And they're doing it so well. And in many cases, they're doing it far better than I can and to far greater length. I need to see what I can offer that is relatively unique, that is individuated. And so if I'm going to talk about any of those things, again, I want to line them up back on my original mission. But every now and then I just want to cut loose and start talking about one of my favorite things because it's one of my favorite things.
yeah, it's those. But cutting back to science fiction, I thought
Hmm.
that's interesting what you said about Jeff Vandermeer, because I actually think he's one of the few who's managed to find that balance. Um, though if you're familiar with like Stalker and H.P. Lovecraft, then there's some people who might scoff at it.
Yeah, I mean his thing is that he seems to be trying to take some of that basic flavor and meld it with stuff that's more postmodern.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That there's more of an explicitly postmodern sensibility in there, where we're not just talking about cosmic horror, but we're also talking about um, the fact that this is happening to people who already have an existing consciousness of such things. We're already, in a way, they're already primed for the idea that the world is ending around them.
Mm-hmm.
They're not cushy, not people who are living in relatively protected circumstances to begin with. We're all becoming painfully aware of how the world is tearing itself to pieces around us.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's looking at it from that point of view. So what will happen when these things happen to that kind of mindset? And I do think that's interesting. The work itself, not as much to my taste, but I set my tastes aside from my recommendations in terms of what I think is going to be constructive.
So okay, I'll ask you this because I'm curious, and
Sure.
I have a show called State of Science Fiction, so maybe I should save it for that if I ever have you on.
Hmm.
But who do you think is the best science fiction writer who's still living?
That's a tough one because
Because for me, I would say Vandermeer, but I mean, I'm curious what you would think.
I'm a little part of the problem is that I want to say again, Sam Delaney, because he's
Mm,
technically still alive. He just hasn't produced any new science fiction in a very long time. My second round draft choice would be William Gibson,
mm.
because while he has produced work very slowly and only quite intermittently, he still managed to stay relevant. This for me is a real accomplishment. He writes his first novel is Neuromancer,
Yeah,
and that is
I've
basically
wanted to read Neuromancer for a long time. I
yeah
just haven't. I'll admit, I'm not the biggest fan of cyberpunk. Um, but you know, I do want to try it though because I know it's a big
yeah
touchstone of the genre of science fiction
because he
anyway.
writes he writes that, and it becomes this enormous thing. It basically becomes the seminal cyberpunk work, and then it's like, where do you go from up? And he somehow figured out how to do that, how to stay relevant, how to stay interesting, how to keep from ossifying. And that's a
Mm.
real challenge, because there are a lot of other people who would have just sort of written the same thing over and over and over again. And he has not done that, to his credit. He's done a lot of things that have they touch on some of the same strands, they have some of the same flavor, but they're absolutely not the same thing. And another one that I could think of, even though technically he's not a science fiction writer, is Thomas Pynchon.
I've want I or well no, I have read Pynchon. I've read Inherent Vice from him, but I've wanted to get more into his work because I was quite fascinated by Inherent Vice. Which I know there's going to be some pension head in the comments whenever I put this up. Who are going to be
Yeah.
like, "That's not his best work. Read like Gravity's Rainbow," and I'm like, "Look, I haven't read it yet, so go away." But I'm quite. He has a very playful style that I thought was really fascinating.
Yeah, for him the whole thing is about the cosmic joke, and that if you're not in on the cosmic joke, you have to be, otherwise you'll just go nuts. And there's a part of me that is really sympathetic to that worldview. He's one of those I only take in small doses, though, because that's not the worldview that I want to exclusively entertain. But I admire the way that he has consistently stayed in this vein and been able to do
Yeah, that's
interesting things with it for so long.
yeah,
Even
that's.
again,
Oh,
if he's
sorry.
only writing very sporadically.
Yeah, that's kind of me with He's one of my favorite writers, but Cormac McCarthy in that way, where I'm like, I mean, I love his work, but it's one I have to take in doses because, like, my God, it
Right.
gets really sad and bleak.
It was the same way with Hubert Selby, who's
Or
one of my other
outright
favorite writers.
horrifying.
Yeah,
If you're
he's
talking
so
like
good,
blood
but you
rage,
have to take him in small doses or you'll just collapse.
I watched the Requiem for a Dream movie, even though I'm very mixed on Aronofsky. I think he's one of those guys who thinks he's more clever than he actually is.
Yeah, unfortunately, he's got brilliant moments, and there are a couple of movies in his catalog I'll take all the way home. But there are times when I just I
I
just
wish
look
he'd
at what
do
he's
more like
doing, and
Requiem for a Dream
I
kind of movies because
yeah.
that seems where he's
Well, I was really angry when that came out, because one of the things that I had wanted to do was a screenplay adaptation of the book itself. Then I found out he had beaten me to the punch years and years and years ahead of time. I'm like, all right, forget it.
I would personally love to do a time out of joint. I'm not really one who would be into doing an adaptation, but if I ever could adapt something to a screenplay, it would probably be time out of joint and do rotoscoped like they did for the Scanner Darkly movie. Because my
Right.
God, that was an inspired choice for that film.
That was a really good idea.
Because like that, I'm like that just perfectly captures Philip K. Dick. This
There's a couple of,
surreal realism in a weird way,
yeah.
if that makes sense. As
There's,
oxymoronic as that sounds.
there's a couple of SF books that I have on a short list that are number one favorites of mine, and number two that I think could be beautifully adapted and wouldn't cost a ton of money. There's another list of books that would cost a ton of money, but the other list I keep because it seems to me like it would be a shoe-in. And one of them is Theodore Sturgeon's More Than Human.
Mm.
And I encountered that fairly young. That was another one that kind of knocked me back quite a bit. And I said, if this is what SF is about, sign me all the way up. And then, of course, I found out that he was another one of those relatively singular talents, and that was also a relatively singular book from a relatively singular talent. So it was an anomaly twice
Well,
over.
I mean, Sturgeon
But
was the one who said like 95% of everything is crap. So I
right,
mean, which is
Surgeon's Law.
I don't know if I don't know if I believe that because like my God, then what's the point of reading if that's what's the point of consuming anything if that's true?
Well, he's probably. I think the reason he came up with that advice was not to discourage readers as such, but to tell other creators that a lot of what you're going to come across, a lot of what you're going to produce is simply not going to be very good, or is not going to be able to give you the kind of direction or inspiration that it really ought to. So you have to be selective, and you have to be adventurous, and you have to also be pretty darn tireless.
Mm-hmm.
There was when I was a number of years ago, when I was reading a bunch of SF, just sort of randomly to get some ideas. I said to myself, when I'm done with this, I could probably write an essay called "How I Read 25 Bad Books in 1 Year," and because some of the stuff that I came across was just dire, and it wasn't because it was poorly written, but because I just felt like I'm not getting anything new here. It's like I've seen this exact same thing. It's like there's a bunch of people, they get into a spaceship, they go all the way out into space, they go look for some weird object, and some weird stuff happens to them. It's like one of the standard, stamp it out of a template kind of science fiction ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, I know that there's a market for people who want that sort of thing, extruded by the yard and shrink wrapped to order. And I'm not going to get in the way of anybody who wants that. But I know that when I'm sitting down to make something, I want to look for something a lot more interesting to me. People will say, I want to write the books I want to see on the shelf.
Mm-hmm.
And I am definitely like that. And a lot of why I'm engaged in this
I
kind
think
of,
that's most writers and anybody
yeah.
who's a creative.
And a lot of why I do this is basically to say, this is what's fueling me. Maybe it'll fuel you too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like another one of my favorite science fiction writers is well, he's one of my favorite writers in general, Ray Bradbury. Um, I actually like Martian Chronicles more than I like Fahrenheit 451, but I like Fahrenheit 451. It's grown on me over the years.
And that's also another one of those books that is fairly heavily misunderstood, and in some ways also, I think,
To be great is to be misunderstood, as
yeah,
Ralph
it's
Waldo
because
Emerson would say.
it's not really about censorship. It's about ignorance. It's about people who are willfully ignorant.
Mm-hmm.
And Bradbury was writing this mainly as a broadside against things like the mindlessness of television,
Mm-hmm.
which at the time for him was really starting to become a big thorn in his side. And a lot of people interpreted it as, they looked at the book burning and they said, oh, it's about censorship. They took the really easy interpretation of it. Have you ever seen the Francois Truffaut version, the movie version?
I've seen clips of it, and it looks really bizarre.
It's not a thoroughly successful movie, but there are parts of it that are astounding. And the last 5 to 10 minutes in particular are some of the most wonderful things I've ever seen, in big part because they happened actually by accident. Minor spoiler. They were shooting the last scenes of the movie outside, and it started to snow. And the production crew was like, we should pack them and go home. And Truffaut said, no, keep shooting. I want to use the snow. And so they were shooting these last few scenes as this blanket of snow just started accumulating over the cast and over the set, because they were outside, and all the way through to the end. And I was like, that's one of those things that you can't make happen. It was just one of those beautiful accidents. And it comes at the end of this movie where everything else in it is so sterile and so precise and so sculpted and so exacting,
Mm-hmm.
And he also had a very specific look that he wanted to bring to the movie. There was a diary that he published about his experiences making it. He said, I wanted the way that the future looked in the film to be a little bit like what a child would imagine, that that the firehouse would be like a toy firehouse and the firemen would be like toy firemen. I didn't want it to look like a Yugoslav film. He didn't want it to look like one of these horribly dour, dysfunctional dystopias. He wanted to look like pop art. He wanted to look like something that people would be seduced into wanting to live in, because that was the whole point.
Yeah, no, that's really well, because I often also gripe about how people often misunderstand Fahrenheit 451. But like, I think Martian Chronicles, I like it more. I should say. I won't.
That's one I've actually never read.
I won't. I won't.
And I
I
feel
won't.
terrible admitting
I
it. I've
won't
read a lot
comment.
of the rest of the stuff that he's done. Like, I came in through The Illustrated Man, as many other people do, and then I read his other short story collections. I read Something Wicked This Way Comes, although I read that many, many years ago, and unfortunately a lot of it sort of dropped through the bottom of my mind.
That's a wonderful book.
I never did Martian Chronicles.
It's really good. It's really good. And though some people could argue quite successfully that it's science fantasy because it's kind of his take on Barsoom and kind of that planetary romance.
I've heard one other description that might even be more precise than that. One of the descriptions I heard is that it's science mythology. That it's not
Wow,
even really
yeah,
a
that's a
fantasy.
good.
It's more like a mythological.
That's
Yeah,
actually a great way of describing it because
yeah,
it is very mythological. That's
yeah.
interesting. I never heard it like, but that's fitting. I like that.
It also squared with the way that something like the second and third Mad Max movie, actually every Mad Max movie except for the first one, which is that it's myth, it's storytelling, it's a fable. It's not
Mm-hmm.
really dystopian. It's not really a post-apocalyptic. And George Miller makes all of these decisions, in terms of the way the movies are filmed, and presented, and mounted, and staged, and all the rest of it to reinforce that. The first one was just basically a tarted up biker gang movie,
Yeah,
and it was originally just going to be,
though
it was originally going to be a very different film, actually.
it does have one of my favorite revenge scenes of all time, where Mel Gibson cuffs the dude's leg to the car, and he's like, "All right,"
Right at the end,
and
yeah.
right at the end, and he's like, "All right, you could probably cut through the chains in about 10 minutes. You can cut through your leg in 5 minutes," and basically just freaking leaves him to die. And it's like,
That's the kind of thing you get in a western. So it has the flavor of a frontier town western, but the others are just they're pure mythology.
oh yeah,
Especially that opening monologue in the Road Warrior, where the feral kid, who is now an old man, is remembering and telling you, he's telling you what was told to him, and
hmm
so you're getting through all of these layers of mythologizing. It's wonderful. I
yeah.
wish more
That's
stuff
an
was like that.
interesting. That's a really apt comparison, actually.
Yeah. And now
Um,
this makes me want to go back and read it and read it for the first time even more. Now that I have this framing for it and a way to approach it, because if I was approaching it as straight SF, I would probably be wrinkling my nose and saying this is way too soft for that.
Yeah, no, it's very much a it's very much a oh god. Well, like I said, it's kind of his take on the planetary romance, kind
Right.
of. But
John Carter.
it's also about like colonialism and humanity's humanity's predilection for destroying things without
Right. We
mean
think everything belongs to us.
destroying beautiful things without
Right.
really meaning to.
This has actually made me think, because the number of actual SF works that I was planning on talking about on my channel at one point or another is very small.
Mm.
Um, like, I was going to talk about Lem at some point, in big part because he's under discussed, and I think he's also not always discussed in the right light. And whenever I was sitting down and trying to make a list of them, I would say to myself, this is so frustratingly small. And this is making me think about how I can actually do that in a slightly more constructive way without feeling redundant. One of the big traps that I've run into is that whenever I wanted to sit down and talk about, like I was just talking about Neuromancer, for instance, and I said, but there's 13,000 other people talking about it. And I want
Yeah,
to talk
no,
about it in a way that
it's
is going to be genuinely supportive of this mission.
yeah. I mean,
And
that's
in a way
why.
that sets the bar a little bit higher maybe than it needs to be. But I do feel that that's the right approach. But something like Martian Chronicles approach from the point of view of it being essentially myth making.
Mhm.
That's something to talk about.
I do hope that you enjoy it when you read it. I think it's one of his best, alongside Something Wicked This Way Comes. I have a soft spot for that book.
Oh wow, very
Um,
clearly.
but I think oh god, who's another one of my favorite? I really like Heinlein. I know a lot of people don't like Heinlein. I was actually having a discussion with Joanna from Joanna Reads about this the other day because we were talking about Stranger in a Strange Land, and I think Heinlein is a very fascinating. I think he's a kind of like what you were talking about with Fahrenheit 451, a very misunderstood writer. Because I think a lot of people take his ideas at face value and not actually what he's talking about. Um, I think there's an honesty in Heinlein's work that a lot of people don't know how to mimic without sounding polemic.
He's one of those authors that I think it's kind of obligatory to have an experience with his work. both the early work and the late work, because they are very, very different flavors. Like the early juveniles, as they're called,
Hmm.
they play off very differently, and they're still very readable from the point of view of being pure adventure. And then his later work, there's much more that's not only political but also deeply personal. That doesn't always translate well to people who don't understand, what Heinlein was trying to unpack with all of it.
Hmm.
And I know that I have had both positive and negative experiences with his work.
I think that's
But I
inevitable.
don't think he's somebody to dismiss out of hand.
I think that's inevitable. Um, I like oh god. Well, I mean, it was because I was talking about how I think that he's a misunderstood writer, and then she pulled out something from Stranger in a Strange Land, which is probably his most polarizing book. Um, that does not age very well, and we were just kind of talking about that. I often compare him to like Joe Rogan, just like in terms of it's not necessarily that he agrees with what he's talking about. He's exploring it. He's interested in what that idea would look like, what it would mean. Because that's kind of what makes science fiction special to me is because we see these concepts and like what would that mean in our world.
Yeah, Theodore Sturgeon does a lot of this sort of thing too in his work,
I
where
might have to check
he will
out
take an
Sturgeon then,
idea,
because
and he will just explore all the way to the end of it. He will just go all the way to the fullest implications that he can find for the idea and lay it out to you. And it's on you to figure out what to do with it. He doesn't necessarily make a case pro or con, although the more of his work you read, the more of a sense you get of where of what his sensibilities are and where his affections go.
mm-hmm.
And I actually have come to like Sturgeon's work better over time because, again, I'm a little older now, and I'm able to see more of the context, and also to see how some of the things in my own life might have squared with this. And with Heinlein, I've had a different kind of reaction where I come back to it now and I say I'm much more selective. I will cherry pick specific things that I think of his that are like really well refined examples of how to do a particular concept well. Like two of my favorite short stories in SF are by him, and they're both about time travel.
Is it all you
One is called
zombies?
By His
Because
Bootstraps.
that was my first one from him, where I was
Yeah,
like, damn, like
and
this is good.
the other one was All You Zombies,
All
which
you
when I read
zombies
that
is
I said to myself,
great.
this could be a Philip K. Dick story by any other name, because it has the same all-consuming paranoia and solipsism and even nihilism in it, and it has one of the best closing lines. And the amazing thing was they have actually filmed this. There's
Yeah,
actually a film
Predestination.
version.
That's where I first
Yeah,
discovered it.
and I
Which is
I,
a
I was
really
like,
good movie. I
and
thought.
it was dumped on the market with like no release whatsoever. I had to go find a copy on Blu-ray and watch it, and I was like, they have nailed all of the really significant important details of this story beautifully. I was amazed that people had slept on it. It just vanished. So
Yeah, and I like Ethan Hawke, so there's that as well. Um,
So a lot of what I think with any author is, if they're being presented to you as somebody who's seminal and somebody who's important, you need to have the experience of encountering them and making up your own mind, and not just to say, oh yeah, everybody else loves him, or for that matter, I could regurgitate any number of reasons why this person is worth liking, or this person is worth hating, or this person is worth being indifferent to.
mhm.
If you're doing your own work, you don't want to just do that. You don't want to just dig up what other people have said and trot that out. You want to have your own experience with it and be able to defend that. And that's actually not something a lot of people train themselves to do.
Yeah,
Or,
I'm actually reading Hyperion right now. I'm getting towards the latter part of it. And I'm liking it. I think it's a really good, strongly written book. Um, and uh, now I don't know if you've read Hyperion, but I thought it was a really I'm thinking because I'm still reading it right now. I just need to find time to read it because I've been ridiculously busy recently. But I think it's a really interesting look at the future and where we'll go, while also being a really compelling story. And I'm like, do more of this, people. More of that. But there's also some things that I think he does get a little too cute with the literary references from time to time.
Well, my
So,
understanding, because I actually haven't read it yet,
oh
is
really?
that
Oh, okay.
it's basically, yeah, it's another one of those things that there's just so much, and so many things slip through the cracks. But from what I understand, this was basically his riff on something like the Decameron or the Canterbury Tales.
Yeah, it's literally the Canterbury Tales in
Yeah,
space. You know.
yeah, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just, okay, what else are you bringing? How are you where are you using this as the framework for something that demands that it be science fiction?
I
And it sounds like he is doing that.
well, what I think is kind of interesting is he's all it's interesting because I haven't really seen this before, but it's kind of a commentary on the genre. Like we see
Mm.
him kind of discuss um you know several parts of it. Like he discusses religious science fiction, he discusses military science fiction. The part I'm about to read, he's discussing he's discussing noir science fiction. Um
When you mentioned religious SF, one of the authors, another one of my favorite authors, just came back to mind because there's some stuff that he did that could be described as that, but not at all in a preachy way, more in a kind of an open, exploratory way. Clifford Simak.
oh yeah, I've heard of him. I'm not
Yeah,
read him yet, but I've heard of
he's
him.
he's another one of these folks. He gets rediscovered periodically, which is nice because he has a lot of material to choose from. And he would touch on religious themes in his books, but again, he didn't do it in a preachy way. He did it in this very open-ended
Hmm.
sense of, if we have a concept of God, um, and then we discovered, say, an alien intelligence that fulfilled all of our ideas about what God could be,
Hmm.
would that be God, or would that just be, a self-fulfilling prophecy of sorts? Would that just be us basically filling in the blanks, so to speak, for what we wanted to see in the universe?
It's funny. That makes me think of, I was talking about Prometheus the other day, the Ridley Scott movie, and I'm like,
Man, that was frustrating.
I know, right? That's what I was saying. I'm like, God,
Half the movie is brilliant, and
there's
the other half is just
I
ridiculous.
was like, there's a good movie in there, damn it. But there's just they make stupid choices. Ugh. They should never have tried to market it as like alien related, because I think that just killed it. But we'll see. We'll see.
Another one that comes to mind, who I'm not a fan of, but I'm kind of I have this kind of grudging respect for his work because it's just so impressive on the whole. Gene Wolfe
Oh
and
yeah,
the
I've
New
heard.
Sun Cycle.
I've read The Land Across by him, and I thought it was just absolute crap. But I am going to be reading The Wizard Knight in either October or November with some friends of mine, so that should be fun. But
Yeah,
yes,
I think the first two books in the Book of the New Sun Cycle in a 2-for-1 edition
I've heard that's
some
like his
time ago.
riff on like Jack Vance and like Dying
Roughly.
Earth, kind
Yeah,
of.
roughly. The big reveal, so to speak, is that you're actually seeing the far, far future after everything has fallen to pieces, and all technology has essentially been replaced with magic, if not being regarded as magic. And I said to myself, I admire the audacity that he's bringing to this, but as storytelling, again, maybe I'm thinking about it in the wrong way. Maybe what he's really trying to do is essentially think about it in terms of it being a future mythos,
Mm-hmm.
and if I come back to it in that frame of mind, it'll make more sense. But I remember being very put off and saying to myself, okay, I think this is a not for me kind of situation. But at the same time, I was looking at it to see what it was about it that would be instructive and useful as a way to point to it, and to use things as a teaching example. That's the way I like to think about these things. I can point to a book and say, this may be heavy going, but here's a couple of things to look for in it that may be useful if you are trying to do X.
Yeah.
And not just to give one of those, but maybe 4 or 5, so people have some choices.
Um. Yeah. No. I'm kind. I'll admit I'm kind of intimidated by Wolf. It's so
He's intimidating. He's a tough read.
because everyone's like, oh man, he's so like. It's kind of like with. It's kind of like Malazan, but with Malazan, it's like a. I don't know if you've heard of or read Malazan, but it's something that's talked about incessantly on fantasy booktube. That's just like, oh, it's kind of complicated. You're gonna have to pay attention, and I'm like, I'll have to be in a particular mood to read it, you know.
I mentioned Sam Delaney before,
Mm-hmm.
and his book Dahlgren is probably
Oh, I've seen people bounce
belongs in
off
that
of that,
category.
and
It's
I've
another one of those books that people they open it and they immediately get lost.
I've heard people bounce off of that, and also and I've heard people who love it. I have a friend named Livia who I've had on my channel a couple times. Um, she loves Babel 17 a lot. I want to try Delaney. It's just one of those case. Well, maybe except for Hog. I don't want to read Hog.
Yeah,
That
no, no,
just
no. That's strictly optional.
yeah.
But stuff like Nova, which is relatively early in his career, Babel 17, the shorter works, they're relatively accessible. There's some narrative tricks in them, but it's nothing that we haven't seen at this point in our cultural point in time. So they're relatively easy.
Yeah, but
Dahlgren is
I'm kind of wary of the new wave because there's some of them who are like too focused on being cute with the literary experimentation and not telling a damn
yeah.
story, which is
I mean,
frustrating.
there was a time when that stuff was very much the rage, and it after a while people realized that it was something that was just it could be so easily indulged in at the expense of just about everything else going on,
Um,
and so it kind of fell out of favor.
though there's some new wave stuff I like. I'm a big fan of High Rise from though I don't know if you
Oh,
could call that science fiction.
Ballard.
I consider it speculative fiction at least, but I do like High Rise a lot. I think that's a great
Yeah,
book.
I I was introduced to Ballard by way of probably his least accessible work,
Oh yeah.
which is the Atrocity Exhibition.
Oh man,
A
I've heard
friend
of
of
that.
mine loaned me his copy of it. It had been recently reprinted in this really big, lavish edition with illustrations. And he loaned it to me, and I remember puzzling over it over the course of like a whole weekend, and just saying, "I don't get this at all." And then it was until it was, and this was when I was fairly young, mind you. I mean, and when I did, while at the same time I didn't get it, I was fascinated because I was also at the time working through my William S. Burroughs experiences, and I said,
Mm.
"This feels like a parallel to that, but it's even more impenetrable." And then I
um,
read some of his other
well,
much more accessible
I was
work.
about to say I think High Rise is pretty accessible for the
It
most
is, it
part.
is.
I
It's
really
gruesome, but it's accessible.
yes, it's I don't know. I guess I'm a very morbid individual. I like morbid stuff, so I'm like, oh, this is great.
I can appreciate these kinds of things up to a point, but I've discovered at this stage in my life that the things that are going to be most motivating to me, most powerful, most interesting, are not in that vein.
Mm.
I can look to them for specific kinds of inspirations. Like if I'm thinking about, oh, I want to evoke a certain atmosphere, a certain flavor, a certain mindset, I can tap into those things. But the very substrate of most of the stories that I want to tell are probably not going to be like that. So I can't really look to those things to get the kind of inspiration to really build a story from the bottom up.
Yeah, no, it's oh man. Um, I really like well, I've only read one Clark, and that is Childhood's End. I really like that book a lot because it feels like a really it feels like a very vigorous history of uh a very well written history book in a lot of ways.
And it's also pretty a pretty good example of his general flavor. Like if you
Mm-hmm.
like that, you'll probably like the rest of his stuff too. And when people talk about Clark, of course, the first thing they think about is 2001: A Space Odyssey, and they don't realize that that's actually something of an exception.
I've only seen the film. I love the
Yeah,
film.
and
Um,
the way that project was conceived was that the book and the film were basically assembled at around the same time in conjunction with each other. And Clark was kind of annoyed with the way Kubrick was taking so long to pull the thing together because some of his own income depended on the book being released, and they wouldn't release the book until the film came out.
mm.
And he said later, that was 4 years of my life. There was 4 of the most wonderful years of my life, and I have absolutely no intention of ever repeating them again.
Yeah, I would like to try more Clark at some point, but I mean, there's a lot of other people I want to try, like Kim Stanley Robinson and
KSR is very much in the vein of the hard conceptual, nitty gritty. He's not so good at the character end of things, but he's really good at the big picture. He's really good at getting this holistic kind of view of what things are going to be like and how we're going to deal
You
with
know, I
them.
read a page of Red Mars at my local bookshop the other day, and I'm like, man, this is well written. So, there's not a lot of great, well written science fiction, unless it's like Bradbury or Clark. Um, I mean, I like PKD a lot, but I wouldn't call him the greatest prose stylist in the world.
He wasn't trying to be.
And
And
no, he wasn't trying to be. That's the
yeah,
thing.
he was going out of what he felt would be the natural way to relay the story. And I like that because it
Though
meant
I
that
do
there was
think
actually very little getting in the way of this strangeness that he was just sort of suffocating in.
yeah. No, but I do commend him. I think he could be really immersive at times when he really was on it. Um, but yeah, I would agree. He wasn't trying to be like he wasn't trying to be
And he
oh
didn't have
god.
to be.
And he didn't
That
have
was
to
the
be
other
either.
thing.
No.
He did not have to be, and he was great despite that. And this is sort of why, like when people talk about great writers, and they talk about what I've come to call the sentence cult. The people who have this incredibly beautiful carpet of prose on every page. I'm like, that's not always necessary.
No, I agree.
In fact,
Yeah.
I'm a little suspicious of it because I come to that and I say to myself, you know, is this really all that I've come here for? And I find that if I have a book that is beautifully written but that is essentially at heart a fairly superficial treatment of its ideas, I'm going to come away cold. It's nice to have a quotable line. It's nice to be able to see this beautiful metaphor or whatnot. But at the end of the day, I want the whole package, and that includes the story. That especially includes the story, because without the story, everything else is kind of left, drifting.
Yeah, I mean, I asked my friend Jason here, so shout out to my friend Jason Furman if you get this far in the pod. But he actually read a Stanislaw Lem, and he read The Invincible, because I was gonna ask if you read The Invincible,
That's actually one that I haven't read yet.
because he was kind of
Amazingly,
lukewarm on it. So
yeah, because um, there are some books of his that I've read and that I've had really divided feelings about because I knew exactly what he was doing, and at the same time I was saying I don't know that I click with this. Like Memoirs Found in a Bathtub, which starts off in like the first 15 or 20 pages, which are essentially a wraparound.
mm-hmm,
They set you up for a completely different story,
mm-hmm.
and then he actually tells you the story in question, and it's in a very different vein. And I was like, I kind of wanted the story he was setting me up for. And then you have something like His Master's Voice, which is written in a very different tone from almost everything else you've ever done. It's very dour. It's very sad in a way. It's closer to Solaris than a lot of his other stuff in terms of the tone. And this is because stuff like this, the Star Diaries. One of the reasons I recommend it is because the tone is so playful. He's clearly he's running his fingers through these ideas and just letting them slip through his fingers over and over again, like riches.
Yeah, no, it's. I mean, I've wanted to try Lem. I just don't know where to start. I've thought about like
Solaris
Solaris.
is not a bad place to start if you just want a single work. And my recommendation, where possible, is you pick up the translation by a guy named Bill Johnson. And I think it's only available in the US on Kindle
Hmm.
because there's some bizarre rights issue involving the English translation of the book that
Isn't
prevents
there
that from being.
always?
Yeah, it's weird because the first, you're going to love this. The first English translation of Solaris was translated from the French. There was it because he originally wrote in Polish. The French translation was made, and then the English translation was made from the French version for some inexplicable reason. And then there was this whole big tie-up with the translation rights. And I think the only way they were able to get around it was by ensuring that the new English translation was only produced digitally rather than in physical editions. So that's the version to start with because it's the most faithful and the most readable.
Yeah, I mean,
And
there and also there's just a bunch I haven't read yet, like Delaney and John Bruner and
John Brunner, Stand on Zanzibar and The Shockwave Rider. I read those two when I was in high school. And it wasn't until later when I was rereading The Shockwave Rider, and I was saying to friends, this book was written in 1974, and it not only predicted the internet, it predicted WikiLeaks. The book
all
is
right.
way ahead of its time.
Yeah, I mean, like John Wyndham, because they put out some new copies of his work, and I've been eyeing them at my local bookshop. But I digress. Oh man, there's so many other ones. Like I want to try like Michael Moorcock's sci-fi works at some point. I don't know when I'll get to that.
Moorcock's, everybody starts with the Elric series, and honestly, that's not a bad place to begin because,
Oh,
in a way, it's like he's
I
trying
love
to
Elric. It's a lot of
he's doing,
fun.
again, he's doing the mythologizing thing. He's trying to create his own artificial, personal mythology.
Hmm.
And in a way, he was also trying to work through some of his own psychological issues, and you can kind of tell, but it doesn't get in the way of the storytelling. It's still great storytelling.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. Oh God, who else? I read Light last year by M. John Harrison. And I thought it was a really fascinating book.
There's a name I haven't heard in forever.
He's not really talked about on. He's very much a
No, he
cult
isn't.
writer.
He's yeah, because he was mentioned as being part of the British SF New Wave, and he's never completely disappeared from the scene. But at the same time, his star has never really fully ascended. And every now and then, somebody will come along and mention one of his books, and go, it's funny. More people should talk about it because what I've read of has been really interesting.
Yeah, I thought Light was. I mean, it was up there with like Jeff Vandermeer, where I had a really interesting experience with it. Um, he took science fiction in a direction I wasn't expecting. Um, and it's I recommend it for like Philip K. Dick fans a
Yeah,
lot because it's
and then
very
there's
PKD at points, like with the drugs. He calls it twink, which I had to snicker a couple times because
yeah,
you know.
clearly the product of an earlier era.
um, I don't even know if I fully understood a lot of what was going on, but I thought it was really just like he took a bunch of leaps, and I really respected him for taking those leaps. Though I've heard Nova Swing is even better, so I mean, I'm looking forward to
Yeah,
that book.
I'm really happy that a lot of these folks are getting reissued because it's like they came out, they made a splash, and then they sort of got swept under, and now we've got another generation of readers who's never even heard about this stuff coming along, getting a chance to see it with fresh eyes, and to really think about it, in terms of a whole new context.
Mm-hmm.
Not to see it not just as some flash in the pan, to see whether these things have lasting value.
Yeah, no, it's I but I'm looking forward to reading Nova Swing because I've heard Nova Swing. I've heard I've had friends of mine and people I respect who really like that book a lot. So we'll see what happens there. But I read Centauri Device in high school and I thought it was kind of generic personally. Um, Light though, I thought Light was really fascinating, like way different from Centauri Device. I don't know. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but I thought he's an interesting
Centauri
writer for
Device
sure.
was actually the first one that I bumped into.
Oh,
Um, and I don't remember this was some time ago, and I don't remember the plot details well, but I remember liking the flavor of it.
mm,
And then when I bumped into Gibson's short stories, I said, "Oh, this seems to have something of the same taste to it." That
mm.
they're talking about the same kind of grungy underworld. Despite the fact that, and it was, I was just, familiar enough with the previous generation of what SF had been to understand that this was a reaction to that this was a pushing back against this kind of John W. Campbell sort of optimism,
Well,
saying no, the future is actually going to be pretty bad.
yeah,
It,
that's always the interesting thing about literature in general. I'm quite fascinated by the concept of literature being in conversation with itself.
yeah,
Um,
that
like
each
Philip
each
K.
generation of books is like a discussion or a refutation or an argument.
And we don't talk about it as much in like science fiction and fantasy because we're still kind of on the uphill battle of actually taking it seriously. But I mean, it exists. Like the golden age of science fiction was kind of a response to pulp, and then the new wave showed up, and they're like, well, this is what the future might look like, and now we're in kind of this weird spot where we don't really know where to go next.
I think a lot of it is that our daily existences have, to a great degree, caught up with a lot of the stuff that we were talking about in SF,
Hmm.
or near future SF over the last 30 to 40 years. And so it feels like it's robbed us of what we could be really thinking about in terms of what the near future looks like, except in terms of things like ecological collapse, and that's depressing.
Yeah,
So
that's why I find Vandermeer interesting, because he really goes into that, and apparently he's gone more into that. I haven't read
yeah,
Hummingbird Salamander yet, but
and this was stuff that Brunner was writing about, 40 years ago, when it was becoming, a truly urgent problem, when there were, when there were parts of the planet where it was becoming literally impossible to breathe.
mm-hmm.
And this has not really, it's like the central concern has not aged, but the way that the concern is expressed and the kind of story that it gives a rise to, that has definitely evolved. Where previously in SF it would have given even a rise to something a little bit like the social protest fiction you'd get from somebody like Jack London,
Mm-hmm.
and now it's much more surreal. Now it's much more um, it's much more open-ended. It's not just about saying, we can't let this go on. It's about saying this is what else is going to happen if it goes on, or you know what is this going to do to our psyches, not just what is it going to do to our physical bodies and our world.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting. Yeah, it's like my verbal tick at this point. But I find interesting about people like Philip K. Dick is that they were kind of on that new wave band a little bit, but he was just his own brand of out there. And I really find that he takes that John Campbell quote of make the magical mundane and mundane magical, or something of that sort. And he really took it to the nth degree, I feel, which is why I find his work endlessly fascinating. I mean, I read Ubik a few months ago with a friend of mine, and one of my favorite scenes in the book is when Joe Chip is kind of just going through his life, and he's putting coins into the machines so he can use them. He puts the coins into the door so he can open
Yeah,
it, and like
that will be 5 cents, please.
and
His entire life has been
it's
reduced to
really
operating on a cash subfloor, and finally gets pissed off and he starts jimmying the door to his own apartment, and the door says, "I'll sue." And I'm like,
and it's
that is
it's
that is
freaking
my daily
hilarious.
life. That is
And
what we have come to.
and
Where we get in
that's
our car, and our car is threatening to pull over to the side of the road because we flunked the car's built-in breathalyzer test. This
and it's
We're not quite to that point yet, but that's on the horizon. They want this.
I think what another I think is underrated about Philip K. Dick. He's freaking hilarious at times.
Yes, he is. He's
Um,
very blackly funny,
yeah,
and it's
especially in
very
Ubik
easy
when
to miss this because so
he
much of what
goes
he's
to the
funny about is so sad.
like after the door debacle, he goes to the fridge, and then they ask him for coins for that. And I just busted out laughing. I'm just like, my God, I love him. He's great.
It's terrifying how spot on he was, because he was pulling all this stuff out from an emotional level. He wasn't sitting there and analytically saying, okay, here's where these trends are going to extrapolate. He wasn't doing it in this intellectual way. He was
Yeah, and
doing it from the point of
it is
view
very
of
personal.
this
That's a
sap.
good point.
Right. He was doing it from the point of view of this sap who has a pocket full of nickels, because that's the only way that he can function anymore.
And
That
I
kind
think
of thing.
that's why it's aged better than something like Asimov, where
Yes.
Asimov is very brilliant
Yeah.
conceptually, but just the rest of it is just kind of
Yeah.
eh.
And also, Asimov, the closest thing that I could see to anything like a cyberpunk type of story would be things like The Caves of Steel, which is essentially a noir murder mystery
Mm.
with robots. And there were hints here and there of how about how his world could be a dark place, but even those are relatively um, accessible and clean, because they're coming basically out of things like the noir tradition, and also even
Mm.
things like the tradition of proletarian fiction to some degree.
Well,
Um,
it's kind of interesting because I'm generally kind of averse to the cyberpunk, though I like it in theory because I'm a big noir fan,
it's just so many bad
and I
examples.
love science fiction. So I'm like, dude, this should be great. I should love this, but it's I don't know. And it's political. And I'm like, oh, okay, that's I mean, all right. I like political stuff. I mean, I'll read that. And I don't know. Part of it is because I find transhumanism to be a really creepy idea.
And I think this is the thing, is that when Gibson was writing about it, um, he was also writing about it from the point of view of people who were uncomfortable with being kicked into the future. You know, they were products of their moment in time, but at the same time, they were looking at what was going on, saying, this is for the rich. This means nothing to me. Case, the digital cowboy who's down on the street. That was his world. That was what he knew. Digital immortality was, it was nice to be able to plug in, but at the same time, he realizes that, the world, the meat sleeve that he's in is the one that he's going to have to carry with him, and all of its
Have you read
burdens.
Have you read Snow Crash? Because I've heard people mention
Um,
Snow Crash.
yeah, I did not like it.
Didn't like it.
I was reading it and saying to myself, I see what he's doing. It's very clever, and I'm just not engaged with it at all. It was immensely clever, and there were parts of it where I was laughing. Like the first 100 pages or so, there were parts where I burst out laughing, and then after a while, I stopped laughing, and I realized that he was taking all of the things about his story that I found the least interesting and making them into the substance of the story. And I kind of checked out at that point. And I said, okay, he's just going off in directions that I'm just not caring about. And after that, I was not really inclined to pick up the rest of his work.
That's fair. I mean, I haven't tried any of his work because I don't know. I've gathered the sense from him that he gets a little too cute with the concepts, which is a common gripe I have with science fiction.
Yeah, it's I want a person, and I know that there's a lot of SF that is, because it is SF, it's going to be conceptual, and it's going to start with a concept, it's going to end with the concept. But I need a way in. And if you can give me a person to care about long enough for me to get in, I will stay in.
Mm-hmm.
And again, back to Dick, and that was what he did, is he didn't give us superheroes, he didn't give us geniuses. He gave us people who were basically working crappy jobs. Just those crappy jobs happen to be in the
Yeah,
future.
that was his specialty.
That was that was Rick Deckard. His crappy job is that he has to go out and kill androids, which he doesn't particularly like to do, because he's very conflicted about what this means in terms of, does this make me a murderer? These things have a life of their own, and they clearly want a life of their own. They want a life of their own completely apart from the rest of the human race, and they're trying to get one. Why don't we just let them have it? But I can't let them have it because I can't lose my job. So
Yeah, I
this
mean,
is a, this is a very approachable thing. And I think, the strain in some SF for people say, well, that, we don't want to remain locked down by such mundane things. And I said, yes, but at the same time, you have to plug in somehow. You have to give people some road inwards emotionally.
it was interesting. I thought watching Blade Runner and reading "Do Androids Dream of Electric
Yeah,
Sheep"
that was a real exercise for
because
me,
because if I remember right, I think PKD a few months before he died actually saw like a couple clips
yeah,
of the movie,
he saw like about 30-40 minutes of rough cut.
and he was very pleased with it from all accounts.
Yeah,
He's like,
he was
"That's
kind
the
of knocked
story,
out.
or
He was
that's
like,
the world I wrote when I imagined
yeah,
it." You know?
that's what I imagined in my head. You took what was in my head, you put it on the screen. He was really, really impressed. And the two sit side by side very comfortably, because they try to accomplish many of the same things in very different ways.
Yeah, I was about to
And
say.
I had the pleasure of watching the movie not long after I read the book for the first time. I was
Mhm.
like, I practically had a notebook in my hand, sitting there jotting down all the differences. Like, okay, they didn't have the mercerism, which would have been an interesting thing to keep in there, but I understood that they had to keep things relatively
Yeah,
economical.
I also find interesting in Philip K. Dick is that he acknowledges that religion will still exist in some form. Because one of my big pet peeves is the Star Trek, oh, we'll outgrow all that silly religion stuff,
Right.
which I think is complete nonsense. I love Star Trek. I do. I have a deep love for it, but I don't like that conceit because I just don't think it's realistic.
Yeah. I
As
mean, I
much as
wrote
Richard Dawkins would love that to be the case.
one of my own books, is basically about a far future where there is at least one significant branch of the human race that still very much wants to keep faith and belief of some kind alive.
Hmm.
The problem is that they're doing it in a way that is increasingly unsatisfactory. So it's falling apart from the inside. And one of the main characters is basically the pontiff of this religion, and she pairs up with a guy who's basically a starship designer. He's like Joni Ive in the
Mm.
future, He's currently in disgrace because one of his own ship designs turned out to be defective.
Mm.
And the two of them have this cosmic odyssey, so to speak. And the thing that kept coming to me when I was researching the book was, the idea of belief as a human constant. It's just, it isn't something we were talked into. It's probably not something we're going to be talked out of. But at the same time, we can have nourishing or we can have destructive versions of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that is entirely up to us. That is entirely up to what kind of societies we build. That is entirely up to us in terms of, what we find worth believing in and what we find worth transmitting in terms of the beliefs worth cultivating.
Yeah, I mean,
And
that's another thing I find interesting about Hyperion is because it explores, well, in the priest story anyway, how religion or belief has survived into the
yeah,
future.
and again, I suspect it's because it's not something we're just going to be argued out of. It fills a need, and
Exactly.
it fills a need that is very hard to replace with other things. And so if we're interested in making that into a socially constructive thing, um, we have to pay attention to why people want it and what they try to get out of it. One of the things that gets overlooked about the civil rights movement in the U.S., for instance, was the incredible central importance of the Black Baptist churches
Mm-hmm.
in promoting it and giving it emotional support as well as logistical support.
I mean, the big two guys from that was a Baptist preacher and a Muslim. So there you
Exactly,
go.
exactly.
And a radical or well,
Yeah,
a
that
somewhat
was
radical Muslim.
that was another one of those books that had a formative influence on me without me even realizing it. Was the autobiography of Malcolm X.
Oh, that's a fantastic book.
Yeah, and so it's like these are not things that we're just going to brush off the table. They're going to continue to be with us. We should make the best of them. We should cultivate them in a way that is going to be constructive and positive. And that requires, in a way, that's even harder than just trying to get rid of it, because just trying to get rid of it accomplishes nothing. All it does is make the resistance harder. We should make it work for us.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and it's not just because I do consider myself a spiritual person, and I just kind of bristle at the idea of hardline materialism. It's
Right.
just, I just find that conceit ridiculous. Voltaire said that we would grow out of religion in 200 years. Nietzsche said something similar. Both were wrong. Because, hey, oh, here we are. Christianity's still around. Islam is still around. So, and, I mean, there's always going to be the flagrantly false ones like Scientology.
Right. There's
Uh,
always going to be things there's always going to be forms that it takes that are predatory and that are the xenophobic and closed ended, and there are going to be other forms that it takes that are not any of those things.
mm-hmm.
And again, it falls to us to figure out which ones of those to cultivate and how to do it. My own strain of this, I discovered Zen and Buddhism when I was really young,
Hmm.
and I didn't really understand it, but I thought it was fascinating. And then later on, when I started learning more about Japanese culture generally and about how the two were intertwined, one influences the other, vice versa, and I started actually practicing rather than just reading about it.
Hmm.
Um, that had a pretty significant effect on the way that I saw a lot of things. And I said, this is clearly not something that we can just dismiss and sneer at. And I knew some people in my life were more than willing to sneer at that sort of thing, but they had their own incarnation of it in one form or another. I wasn't going to sass them for it. So, it's all a question of how we choose to do it, and the choices are entirely ours.
That does lead me into another thing because I mean I'm looking at your website and you've written science fiction and fantasy. I am curious, like where your taste in fantasy lies because we've been talking about science fiction for a little
Yeah,
while.
my fantasy stuff is not really with the sword and sorcery end of it, or the like the Tolkien side of it, not so much.
Mm,
It's more things that I think could be better described as um, surreal or even mystical. Like one of the
mm,
books that inspired one of my more recent books in this vein was Doris Lessing, and she
mm,
wrote a book some years ago called "Briefing for a Descent into Hell."
mm,
And I read that book like in like 3 lightning sittings. I just devoured it because on the one hand, I wanted so badly to like it
mm.
because I could see what she was trying to do and I loved the idea, but I thought the execution just just infuriated me because it fell so short of what I felt it could be really about. And I wrote one of my own books as a kind of a response to it. This thing where the inner worlds that we have are created kind of as a response to the insanity of the outside world, as a way to try to mediate that. And I thought, that's a really interesting idea, that we have these worlds within us. So it's fantasy along those lines, along lines that are very inward turned and spiritual. That said, I am interested in exploring stuff that's more conventional in that sense. Like one of the things that I've been mulling.
So would you say you're not like a fan of like like Conan or Lord of the Rings?
I wouldn't say it's not that I dislike them. I
Oh.
think they're cool.
Oh,
I
okay.
think it's more a question of what do I want to draw on to do my stuff? What do I want to, what kind of mold do I want to work in? So I've been looking at stuff that was more inward looking. You mentioned Ballard. There's some of the aspects of what he does that I was highly sympathetic to. William Burroughs again, but there's directions that I want to go in that are probably more conventional. It's just I don't want to necessarily do them in the obvious way. One of the ideas that I'm looking at right now, the way I pitched to my friends was basically Lord of the Rings meets Oppenheimer, and I said try to imagine an intersection.
Say more.
Between,
I'm curious.
Yeah, try to and the idea that I had, and this is a very rough sketch, that it takes place sometime after humanity has managed to free itself from the grip of a group of beings that could be described as gods, wielding something that could be described as magic. And we basically figured out, after a very long period of suffering and privation and slavery, how to steal it away from them, how to use it against them, and how to take these powers and use them to realize all of the unrealized potential that humanity has been building up over the centuries and millennia. And it's so new, we don't even really know what to do with it. It goes back to one of my favorite stories of all time about science, the story about the invention of the laser. When the laser was first invented, they calibrated the power of the laser in gillettes. If a laser beam was powerful enough to punch through one Gillette razor blade in 1 second, it was a 1 Gillette razor. If it could punch through 2 in 1 second, it was a 2 Gillette razor, and so on and so forth. And the whole reason behind this was they had this thing, which at first they couldn't figure out anything to do with it except punch holes in razor blades. They were like, what can we really use this for? And now flash forward to today and think about all the things that we use laser technology for. It's everywhere. It is transformed a lot of aspects of our lives. And I thought about the same thing. Imagine a world where magic is basically new. It has the newness and the strangeness and the excitement that was unleashed on the world in the same way that something like the information technology revolution was new and exciting. We didn't even really know what to do with personal computers when they were first developed. We had to sort of stumble across that. And I thought this would be fantastic to extrapolate to the breadth of a whole society that has just freed itself from this and is trying to figure out what to do next.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Finish your thought and then I'll ask you.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and what they discover to do next is kind of mind melting. So,
I was going to ask, I guess to be more specific, what are some fantasy, rather novels, or I don't know if you read comics or.
A lot of stuff in this vein, definitely from the manga side of things.
I was about to say, I do see Berserk right there. So
yeah, Berserk is absolutely one of my favorite productions of all time.
Yeah,
Full Metal Alchemist.
I went on a binge of it, I think last year or so, and I read the whole Golden Age arc all the way through the Lost Children arc, and then I stopped at the one with the creepy priest guy. I think his name's Brother.
He's kind of a tone breaker, honestly. But I've gone all the way to the most recent stuff. So it's like I'm determined to see this through to the end.
Which little spicy take here for the Berserk fans. I think the Lost Children arc is 10 times more screwed up than the Eclipse. Oh my god! And I read that right before I went to bed, which is a terrible idea. Do not ever do that.
Yeah. My whole attitude is I'm in this for the whole package. I've admired so many aspects of this for so long. I'm just in this all the way through to see it through to the end. But so also stuff like Full Metal Alchemist, and also individual specific works that kind of like one-offs.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like you may know the manga artist Taiyo Matsumoto.
Mm.
He did a 4-volume series called Number Five,
Hmm.
and it's
Okay.
like halfway. It's somewhere between science fiction and fantasy and superheroes, and it has
Okay.
elements of all three of those things. And they're not put together in any predictable way. It's one of those things where I was reading it and saying to myself, I don't really know where this is going to go, but that's the best thing about it. I'm loved being surprised. So
That's
a lot of the things that get drawn to this vein tend to be very singular, and they also don't tend to be very flashy or very widely discussed.
yeah.
They're off in the corner.
I find myself of a similar way. I mean, there are like popular stuff I like. Like Lord of the Rings and A Song of Ice and Fire. Um, but like some of the fantasy that's really impressed me in recent years are just completely out there. I read China Mieville's Baslag 2 years ago, and I fell in love with that series. Well, except for the third book. I thought the third book kind of jumped the shark a little bit. But and I also read like Marlon James's Black Leopard Red Wolf, which I thought was very impressive. Because it's just a completely different thing I've never seen before. You know,
That's
though.
always a pleasure.
What'd you say?
I said that's always a pleasure when you get that thoroughly surprised.
Yeah, no, it's I'm actually reading the second book of that series right now. Though it's weird because it is a very familiar setup. It's a quest narrative. They're trying to find this boy, but just the way it's done. He uses a lot of African oral storytelling techniques, and I was like, holy shit! I was like, what is this? And it's become some of my favorite fantasy of all time now.
That's the thing that I really like about what's happening today is that you're getting new voices, you're getting new storytelling patterns. You
Mm.
mentioned the African oral tradition. That made me think of Simbane again. That these are things that have been um, in existence for so long, and they've had their own life, entirely outside of a lot of what we're familiar with in Western culture. And so when they're brought in this elegant and inspiring way, they're really special.
Yeah, and I mean, I know there's probably other books that are written like that, but maybe it's just the novelty for me. I don't know, but though it was a little easier for me because I was kind of familiar with how African oral storytelling worked
Right.
because when I was a kid, I went to this writing conference, and there was this guy who would stand. There was a guy who would stand there at the beginning and would tell oral stories. Um, so I kind of understood the gist of it. He wasn't telling like African stories, but he was telling, very much in that fluid
Right.
oral style.
We're back
Which,
to myth making again.
yes, um, I might even dare say it's like mythological fantasy, if that makes any sense. Like it's not
Yeah,
really
yeah.
like Norse myth or like it's not like literal mythology, but it's like creating a new mythology. It's
Yeah,
nuts.
and the rules for that, they're gonna play differently from conventional fiction where you have these very obvious tight structures, and there are all these appeals to modern psychology and so forth.
Though I mean Baz Lag though I was just really impressed with I mean I don't know if you've read China Mieville, but um I really love the setting. I really love how he makes it into a character of its own. And there's almost this at least in Perdido Street Station, there's this very Dickensian feel to it, but it's even angrier than Dickens was because
Yeah, Mieville is very he wears his left wing heart on his sleeve pretty prominently.
I don't. I would say that our political beliefs are very. I would say my political beliefs are very much the opposite of Mr. Mieville's, but I think that point of view is really fascinating. I mean,
Yeah,
let me put it this way: like, how often have you read about political activism in a fantasy novel?
it's hard to put it in there again for the reasons I described, because
And it works because
a lot of the modern ideas that we have about politics are not going to transplant into a fantasy setting where even the idea of a nation may not exist. You may have kingdoms, you may have empires, but the idea of a nation, which is a completely different kind of political construction, doesn't exist. The idea of a political party doesn't even exist, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, like I
So a
mean,
lot
if
of
you
those
see that in
ideas
like Game
are
of
really hard to
Thrones,
translate.
it would be silly. It would just be completely ridiculous.
Yeah, you'd have to find some way to have it work
But
locally on its own
and
terms, and again, that's really hard.
and I mean, I'm not saying that like all fantasy now should have like political activism. I'm just saying I thought it
Right.
was really fascinating how he did it.
It's just in order for it to work in that setting, you need to have prerequisites. You would
Hmm.
have to have some you would have to have some prerequisites set up, within the setting that make contextual sense. It's not something you can just drop right in.
And sure, I mean, Perdido Street Station's kind of a steampunk novel. I know steampunk's kind of its own thing, but like, I don't know. I had not seen anything like that. And it's one of those novels where I'm like, man, I wish more stuff like that was written. You know,
It's
aside,
hard.
I mean, as much as I like the kind of Howard Tolkien model of storytelling, and I think you could do a lot with it. There's
Yeah.
definitely fantasy authors nowadays who, really modernized that, like, George R. R. Martin and Joe Abercrombie, even Marlon James to an extent, even though he goes in a completely different direction. Um, with, I love Black Leopard, Red Wolf. That's, if that wasn't already apparent.
But yeah, it's really difficult to do that stuff well, and also to get a market for it, because one of the things about book marketing today is that anything that isn't only incrementally different from what already exists has a strike against it, possibly too. And a lot
Or
of what I was doing, I was not seeing a market for, honestly. And I said, I might as well just put it out on my own and just make it look as good as possible on my own.
like
Although,
American Gods, for instance, which, say whatever you will about Neil Gaiman. I know he's not everyone's favorite person right now. That's what I've been saying for the
yeah, that's a totally
past
separate issue
past
from his
couple
work.
months.
Yeah.
But he's the only fantasy author I have encountered who's actually made a career while not adhering to that model, or those models, I should say, because Howard and Tolkien are very different
Right.
animals.
And he's also been very big on the idea of the modern mythology.
And he he uh and he's promoted other books that I probably would have never read if he hadn't have brought it up. Like I read Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which that blew my hair back. I thought that was bit long, bit dense. Yes, it took me 4 months to read it, but a phenomenal book. One of the best. Ironically enough, as much as I love the fantasy genre, magic is not something I focus on very much in fantasy. It's more about the vibe, the world where it's at. I'm more interested in. Have you ever read? Le Guin's From Elfland to Poughkeepsie?
I've read a lot of other stuff by Gwyn, but not that one.
Oh, damn. Well, the point I'm making is I'm more interested in her idea where she's talking about you're creating a different world. You're creating a different setting that is not our world.
Different presumptions,
Yes.
and different normative ideas.
Like that's what interests me in
Yeah,
fantasy more often
and it's
than like
really difficult
magic.
to do it. It's not just because it's difficult to come up with those kinds of things. It's not just difficult because you're trying to free yourself of your conceits, of the here and now. I actually have a book I talked about recently that I'm going to touch on in a moment that was really good about that. But the other thing that's hard about it is being able to get that to the reader who's here and now,
Mm.
and to build a bridge to the reader here and now to wherever it is that you're trying to take them. That's even more difficult. So whenever somebody's able to do that elegantly, whenever they're able to find a mode for that kind of story that draws us in, us modern readers, that's a real accomplishment. Le Guin was really good at that kind of thing. The book that I was going to
One of my
mention,
really sad blind spots is I haven't read Le Guin, and I want to really badly. I just
yeah,
don't know where to
Earthsea. Start
start.
with Earthsea. It's very easy to get into, and it's beautiful. And
I
the
do
other
want to
book,
pick up that Charles Vess edition that they put out a few years ago because I really like Charles Vess's artwork a lot.
gotcha. But the
Um,
other book that I was going to mention, which I talked about fairly recently on my channel, that addresses this very problem and addresses it in a really novel way. It's a book called "But What If We're Wrong" by a guy
huh.
named Chuck Klosterman. And the subtitle of the book is "Thinking About the Present as If It Were the Past." And the whole premise of the book is that our ideas about the future are almost always rooted in our ideas about the present in such a way that it becomes very difficult to really think about the future as a different place.
That
We
kind of
think,
reminds me of something Alan Moore said in an interview I watched about V for Vendetta.
Mhm.
Well, before he just repudiated it completely. Um, he's like, when you're writing science fiction, you're not writing about the future. You're writing about the present.
Yeah, you're writing about the present in disguise.
Yeah,
You're using the future as a proxy.
yeah,
You're using
exactly.
it as a
That's almost
distancing
word for
device.
word what he said. He's like, in science
Yeah,
fiction, you're given wiggle room
yeah.
to move.
And one of the things about this Klosterman book was that he gives you a lot of um, conceptual frameworks and, in a way, kind of exercises in the form of these essays about various subjects to teach you how to think a little bit differently. Like one of the chapters he goes into is he explores the idea that in any number of years, the whole concept of physical sports as we know it may disappear because we've come to associate things like tackle football with brain injuries and so on. And he speculates out the idea of what if all of this stuff just drops out of the culture because it becomes simply socially
Well,
unacceptable.
that's a
How hard is that for us to really think about? And it says, but think about how smoking also became almost completely culturally unacceptable. Think about any number of other things that became culturally unacceptable because of all these other shifts in our culture about what we want and what we didn't want and how those things were presented to us. So he's not saying that it will happen. He's not saying it won't happen. He's saying, how could we think about it?
yeah. I
And
was
I
about
thought that
to
was one of the really
say.
refreshing
I don't
things in the
think
book, is that it's
sporting
not
is
telling you
gonna.
what to think.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I was gonna quibble. I don't think sports is gonna go away anytime soon.
No, I don't either. It's just, but he's giving you a way to think about how that could be
Hmm.
possible, and along with any number of other things in the same vein. And I think that's why the book is valuable because he's not making a case for any one particular set of ideas about what the future will be like, but more about how to do these exercises to free yourself from preconceptions about the future because of our prejudices in the present.
That's
And I
interesting.
think that's a really valuable thing for anybody to do who wants to write SF or even fantasy.
I might pick that up actually. That sounds
Uh,
really interesting.
Let me my story. I found this book on the shelf when I was in Barnes and Noble one day, and I opened it. And I started to read it, and an hour went by, and I realized I was halfway through the book, and I said, "I'd better buy this and go home before the shopkeeper gets mad at me." And I did exactly that. I bought it. I went home and I started
Before the
over.
store closes and he kicks you out.
Yeah, and I started the book over. I reread the whole thing, and then more recently, I reread it a third time to prepare for that video, and realized, oh, this is aged beautifully. It's not even that old a book, and I can tell that it's already going to be valuable in yet another 20 years.
That's always interesting. I see you talked about Sun Ra, which I'm a big
Mm.
jazz fan, so
Yeah, same here.
I'm well aware of Sun Ra. Though I'll admit I'm more into like the Miles Davis, John Coltrane
Oh,
kind
sure.
of
Those are how I got in.
classic
But
style. Sun Ra's a
my
little
approach
too
with him,
weird.
my approach with him was to say, this is like the kind of figure that you might see in speculative fiction of one kind or another, except he's real life. And
Yeah,
the
I was
real
about
life
to. I was
example,
that brings another question. Like, do you think there's such a thing as like science fiction music? Well, that isn't filk because I've listened to something like Radiohead's OK Computer or even Kid A, and I think this sounds like music that would be made in the future.
I've got two things I'm thinking about.
And Sun Ra is
Very,
very much in that vein
yeah,
as well.
three things. Okay, one being Sun Ra because it's very much the same, and the other is the band Death Grips, who have quickly become one of my favorite bands after I discovered them not all that long ago. I said, "Wow, these guys are doing something. They're doing the kind of music that I would expect to hear in a cyberpunk future." And then I realized, holy, wait a minute, we are in a cyberpunk future. That's why they're making it.
Have you seen those? Have you
And
seen those Tesla cars driving around at all in your?
I've seen two Cybertrucks in my neighborhood, and they are the ugliest things I've ever seen in
Isn't
my
that
life.
creepy? Oh
They
my
look
god,
like somebody
I saw
took
them. I've
something.
seen three when
Yeah,
I've driven to my
they're like they're
college.
like something that was driven off of a movie set. They're like the ugliest movie prop you've ever seen in your life.
Well, I don't know
and they're
about
even
that.
gaudier in person than they are in film.
It was a
But yeah,
weird
so
moment for me. I'm like, Jesus Christ, we are in the future right
yeah.
now.
So it's like, and Death Grips is like one of the few bands I can think of because of the kind of music they make and what it's informed by and who they're trying to reach that feels like that kind of thing. And the third person that I'm thinking about is the composer Karl-Heinz Stockhausen. It was a German composer from the 20th century to just into the 21st century. And he was one of the first composers to create electronic music and also to create music that was informed by things that I could describe as science fiction concepts in a highly spiritual vein. He's a fascinating figure. And the music that he made, I should say, some of it is going to be highly inaccessible to most people. But when I was listening to some of his work, and I'm a big fan, so I have a lot of it, and I said to myself, this does sound like the kind of thing that would come from a science fiction setting, except that he was a real person and he was making all of this with a straight face. And all of the reasons why he did what he did, he was able to defend beautifully. You know, he's a tremendously intelligent man. And whenever people would say to him and go to him and tell him his music was incomprehensible, whatever, he would lay it all out and say, you know, it's on you. You're the one that's not, you know, making the step towards me. So when I think about the idea of, you know, music as science fiction, that's three examples I can think of right off the top of my head. And there's probably more of them.
That's
Not because
interesting.
of,
I might have to check those out.
yeah,
Well,
I
I have.
actually want to talk about. There's a couple of books about Stockhausen, one that's older and a couple that were more recently revised after his death. That I'm probably going to break out at some point. I'm going to talk about them in the same way that I talk about Sun Ra for many of the same reasons. So that'll be worth following up with. But yeah, that's what I was thinking about. Like that is the music of the future.
Yeah,
And we're
right.
living in a future that we used to think about. So
I
there you go.
find that really fascinating. I mean, I'm not trying to discount Filk. Filk has its place, but like
Sure.
that's like how do you describe Filk? I don't
It's
know.
by fans and for fans.
Yes, exactly.
You know, and there's a place for that. But you know, we're thinking about something that would be more like an in-universe creation.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's out of universe. This is stuff that could conceivably be in universe. So there's the big difference.
Yeah, it's I also did a video of the Oppenheimer book. I actually American
Right.
Prometheus. I actually own that book. I haven't cracked it open yet, but I saw Oppenheimer, and now I wouldn't call it one of Nolan's best films, but I do think it was very well made, and I was very I got really interested in figuring out more about Oppenheimer, so I picked the book up. Um, is it good?
I read. I. It is. It's an excellent biography, and I read it actually side by side with Richard Rhodes' book, The Making of the Atomic Bomb, which you can. It's actually just barely glimpsable on the shelf behind me, along with Dark Sun, the follow-up. And a lot of that I was reading both for my own edification, also as a precursor to that other project that I was describing,
Mm-hmm.
because of, you know, the whole way these things were made was, you know, there wasn't any one person. Oppenheimer was certainly at the center of the project to you know, create the atomic bomb as an orchestrator and also as an originator of some key ideas. But it took basically a whole generation of scientists to contribute all the pieces that were necessary.
Mm-hmm.
And the Rhodes book really explains, you know, step by step how all of these different ideas flowed together to make this thing possible. You know, the idea of the one scientist who has the one brilliant discovery that changes everything leaves out the whole generation of other scientists around him that were probably contributing to the way that his ideas took shape in the first place.
Yeah, it's I mean I haven't read it yet because, well, one, it's a long book, and two,
Yeah,
I like to set time for things before I
it's
start
it's
them.
very absorbing though. It's very nicely written,
um, I
and there's
mean,
a great sense of what the man himself was like, and that's preserved pretty well in the movie too.
yeah, it's kind of interesting watching the movie because he seemed like this kind of neurotic individual.
Yeah, I mean, he was a human being, and that was the thing that I think was really well conveyed, is that for all of his scientific genius and all his intelligence, he was a flawed person. He had his lusts, he had his confusion, and anytime we pretend those things don't exist in someone who is, you know, at that level of brilliance, we're only kidding ourselves.
Oh hell, like Albert Einstein was freaking gash hound, man.
but it's also, it's
Which
about.
I always think is
Um,
hilarious because, like,
I
I
like
mean,
it. I
he's
like
not
it
much of
when
a
there's a
looker,
certain
you
amount
know.
of.
You've
I
seen
like it when
photos
there's
of.
a certain amount of demythologization about the way science itself works,
Mm,
because it's a human thing. It's done by people, and that
mm-hmm.
means that there are times when it's going to be done out of prejudice, or out of blindness, or out of the need to do things that aren't necessarily humane. And I like it when we can talk squarely about that and not shy from it.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny. I love science fiction so much, but I was never really. I just couldn't understand science. To be honest with you, it's not my wheelhouse. Um,
I'm very much a fan of hard science books that are well done and that take a complex concept and lay it out, plainly and beautifully. There's a cosmologist guy named Lee Smolin who I've been reading. I've been working through pretty much all of his books in sequence chronologically, and he
I was gonna
has.
say Carl Sagan, but
Yeah,
keep
he's
going.
in a way he's continuing some of that work, but in a different vein. One of his more recent books is called Einstein's Unfinished Revolution. I should probably talk about this at some point. And it's
Ooh,
basically about how quantum physics has hit a wall because there are certain things it cannot explain effectively. And in order to make any progress, we need to have a better physical theory that can explain the things quantum theory can't. And he talks about what those possibilities might be, what they might look like, why they might look a certain way versus another way. And he does all this in very easy to approach, plain, and often lyrical language. And I'm like, this is great. There are no formulas in the book. There's maybe one formula tops, and so
that's
it's
interesting.
it's
I
a
might pick
it's
that
very much
up
an
because,
easy read.
like, because a lot of the science books I've read that aren't just you know, atheist hardline materialist stuff.
which
Um,
is which is dull, honestly.
um, um, like I do like The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, even though I don't think very highly of Dawkins at all.
Right. I mean, it's interesting for the ideas. I can do without Dawkins, the man, honestly.
Yeah, just
But he had some useful things to square off with him in that book.
he's better when he's doing it's better when he's actually talking about science and when he's not trying to be like a religious scholar because it's just, oh my god, it's
Right.
painful to
That
watch.
that does get embarrassing. There are people who are far better equipped to do that, honestly.
It's
But
oh
the
god.
actual when somebody finds a complex subject and delivers it in a way that is wonderfully easy to wrap one's mind around, I sink into that and just hug it. Another one of the authors who's been doing a lot of this lately. Um, Let me see. I can never pronounce his name correctly, so I'm going to have to look this up, and I feel very embarrassed about that. Oh, Rovelli. God, it's so simple. Carlo Rovelli.
It's very
And
Italian sounding.
yeah, he has. For some reason, I kept thinking his name was Rovin, and I'm like, why am I? I'm bad with names. That's my one big embarrassment, is that I'm terrible with names. But Rovelli has written a number of books that explore much the same kind of space. Like, what is at the very edge of quantum mechanics? What is at the very edge of theories about the substance of the universe? And they're all really short. They're only like 120, 150 something pages. They're super easy to read. They're super digestible, and they're beautifully written. So these are the kinds of things that I really like to pick up. And again, there's no math because I'm
Yeah,
terrible at
and
math.
I've
I can't
noticed a
wrap
lot
my head
of
around
like
math, but I can wrap my head around a good explanation, a good analogy. Give me a
yeah, and
good
I've noticed a
analogy
lot of
all the
like
way home.
science writers try to rip off like Carl Sagan, but they just don't do it as well. Like, I've
Yeah, I mean, there's a point where that starts to become a little embarrassing, especially if they're not telling me giving me any really new information. They're not telling me, okay, here is a possibility that has not really been considered very widely yet. Let me lay out why it's significant. One of the authors I liked, that I talked about recently, a guy named Jim Holt, and he had a book that I originally didn't have much of an opinion about, but I reread it and liked it a lot better on the second time. The book is called "Why Does the World Exist?" And it is an attempt to lay out a lot of different arguments from different points of view, from different expertises, from different perspectives about why there is something instead of nothing. And he doesn't try to come up with an answer. He tries to show you why people think about this question in the different ways that they do, what informs their worldview about it, what informs the conclusions they could come to it, and how those conclusions might conflict with each other. There's some of the people that he talks to who think the question itself is stupid and shouldn't even be brought up. It's self-evidently ridiculous. And there's some other people he talks to who say, this is the most important question we could ever ask. And you
Yeah,
say to
I
yourself,
mean,
how can these two people even exist in the same room together? So
yeah, I mean,
he's a really good
it's
example of this kind of thing done well.
yeah, I mean, I generally have very little patience with materialists in general because a lot of them have that like cut and dry view, and you can't really talk them out of it. Where it's kind of
Right.
ironic. It becomes kind of a religion in and of itself,
Yeah.
really.
I don't go to people like that to tell me what to believe, but
Yeah,
I do go to people like that to try and understand why things might be constructed the way they are. And I think those are two very different impulses. Those are two very different needs to be satisfied. If I want a spiritual answer, I have places I can go outside of the materialists to get answers to those questions.
yeah,
But there are
no,
times when I do want a materialist answer to things, and there are plenty of people I can pick from that are going to stay within their lane, so to speak, and give me good, satisfactory answers to those highly
though.
specific
I
questions.
saw a tweet the other day, and you know how Twitter is. You don't always go there for enlightened discussion about.
Here's a confession: I actually don't read Twitter.
That's fair. I use it a lot, so I kind of scroll. So I guess that's a fault of mine, but yeah, whatever. But anyway, I I saw someone, I won't name them, but I saw someone talking about how science fiction is an inherently Christian concept, and I just couldn't help but laugh. I just thought that was
That's
ridiculous.
that's certainly one of the ideas of all time, as they say.
It's like, yeah, science is about enjoying God's creation. I'm like, okay, yeah, but that's not like, yeah, no, that was a brain hurty take.
Yeah, that's not really anything I can connect with. I'm sorry.
I was like, oh my god, this is embarrassing. But I didn't say anything. I'm like, you know what? I'm not gonna argue today. I'm just gonna keep going on my way.
And so it's also frustrating because there are plenty of people who've done hard science and at the same time will profess a belief in God of one kind or another, and they don't see a conflict between these two things at all. They see the universe that we've been given as something that has a materialist explanation, to be sure, but God is something that we have internally.
hmm
And I don't ever want to try and argue people out of any of this stuff because there's no point. We're all here to find our own answers.
Yeah, no, it's just it. Like I said, the kind of new atheist thing has become kind of a religion on its own matter, which is I don't know if that's irony or if that's just straight up predictability. I have no clue.
Yeah, I mean, I was peripherally interested in some of the stuff that was going on in that space when um, I was in the skeptic space, so to speak, for some time.
hmm
And after a while, I realized I don't really need to confine myself into this space, so to speak, to get the maximum benefit. The ideas, about how to think critically and things like that. Those are pretty open-ended ideas. They don't
Yeah,
require commitment to any one particular social circle to be useful.
and I mean,
And then I started hearing about a lot of the sex pest stuff that was going on amongst the self-proclaimed, people at the top of that pyramid. And I said,
oh my
okay,
god,
we don't need that either.
no.
That was depressing.
And I mean, that's not. I'm not trying to say like science fiction is inherently secular either. I think I said
No,
religious science
it's
fiction is a
open-ended.
thing.
It's large. It contains multitudes.
Exactly.
It's supposed to. That's one of the
Though
things we love about it.
I can concede that it does kind of lend itself more to secularism. Though I think that might be a little narrow view.
It can, and then at the same time, you have people like Cliff Simak, I mentioned before, who can show
Philip
you
K.
how
Dick
these how
even.
these things can entertain spiritual concepts, and of course, Dick himself.
hmm
And they're all it's open ended, and the whole point is that you go in there, and you're going to
We
see
we need more
all of these
quality
people.
spiritual science fiction writers.
Yeah, that's a tall order to fill because it's very easy to indulge in a lot of simple-minded thinking, a lot of stuff that's just taken from outside as dogma and recycled. I mean, that's one of the things I admire about Dick was that he was pulling all this stuff from some deep place within himself, and it was entirely his. It's really rare.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't call The Man in a High Castle one of my favorite of Dick's works, though I think it's quite interesting. It's the only one of his that actually won an award, funnily enough. Um, but I find it quite interesting how it's not really the typical alternate history plot. It's more, here's these people in this weird world,
Yeah, and they're
and also
coming to terms with it.
there's the
They're
I
coming to
Ching,
terms with it as best they can.
and
They
then
only have themselves and each other.
there's the weird like I Ching stuff where you're
Yeah.
like, what? Okay, I'm
I
not
had
familiar
I
at
had a
all with the
I
I
had a
Ching, so
fascinating discussion with friends of mine who just hated the ending of the book. And they challenged me to interpret what was going on at the end there. And I said, I think the point that is being made here is that so much of what is going on in the story is it's kind of like it's his way of saying that history is a trap, and that any way that we can find our way out of that trap, even if it's only through spiritual resources, is going to be worth it. Just to be able to think of a way that's different is itself an act of resistance. Just to be able
yeah.
to
It's
imagine that things can be different.
have you ever watched Damian Walters' channel?
I have never heard of him.
No, it's funny you bring up act of resistance because he made a video about the man in the high castle and he described it as an act of narrative warfare in
That's not a
his
bad
video.
description of what goes on.
Yeah, I might link that to you afterwards, and after this is over. Um, but that's funny you brought that up. It made me think of that.
Yeah, because there's all this stuff in the book about, there's these suggestions of how things could have played out differently in that book's world. And that's all a hint to us too, that history is not necessarily written ahead of time. That nothing is preordained. That everything
No,
is about
it's
everything is about what we choose to have.
what I think is one of the things I think is hilarious about that book is how there's an alternate history within the alternate
That's
history,
exactly what I was
and
talking about. Yeah.
it's not
It's
just
not our world
and it's not our
either.
world. Yeah, it's
Yes,
a
it's not, that's the
weird.
whole point, is that there are any number of possibilities that don't look anything like what we have. And that, to be even that, because the whole thing that they're trying to snuff out is the idea that anything can be different,
Mhm.
that it could be different anyway. To even imagine a different future is taboo.
Yeah, no, it's
I wanted to actually stop for a moment and check your time on this, because we've been on for 2 hours, and I wanted
oh
to see what your time is like.
oh well, yeah, I thought maybe we'd go on for a couple more minutes and then we'd stop, but yeah,
Sure,
um, I was about to say, yeah, I was thinking of wrapping things up, but I thought we could go on for a couple more minutes before
sure.
we get going. Um, but yeah, no, yeah, that book's really fascinating. I was talking with another friend of mine. Her name's Whitney. She runs a channel called The Secret Sauce of Storycraft. I think I am a really bad friend. I apologize if she ever watches this.
It's okay. I have trouble remembering the names of things all the time.
Yeah, I'm like, ah, man, it's not as easy as
Chronic with me.
it's not as easy as Philip Chase Best of Fantasy, or Mike's book reviews where
I'm
you're.
actually subscribed to Mike's, obvious, because that's how we bumped into each other. And Chase, I had recommended to me, and I subscribed to his channel also. And I'm really interested in all of the different approaches that people take with this stuff.
Mhm.
A big part of why I started doing this at all was because I wanted to find a differentiator. So by looking at other people and saying, okay, well, they're talking about this, and how are they talking about it? And that's information.
Well, a lot of my motivation was here's these authors I see that aren't really talked about much. I'm going to add my own perspective here and talk about them so more people can go read them.
Yeah, evangelizing for the hidden treasure. That's always a great
Like,
thing.
ooh, have you ever heard of this Philip K. Dick guy? This guy's great. Well, Philip K. Dick's weird. He's like underrated, but he's become more like well regarded in recent years.
He's gotten a really expanded amount of attention. I mean, the TV series for The Man in the High Castle. It's really funny because the guy for so long was considered unfilmable, and now the language of movie narrative and TV narrative have advanced to the point where a lot of the stuff that would previously have been considered unfilmable is now fodder. I actually blame. I shouldn't say blame, but I give credit to David Lynch
Ha.
for all of this um, because of Twin Peaks. Twin
Mm-hmm.
Peaks gave TV the freedom to be weird in a big country way. And that has paid tremendous dividends over the years, because people realized, hey, we can do this kind of nonlinear stuff and this weird experimental stuff and this weird psychological stuff, and people will eat it up. The X-Files was only possible because of something like Twin Peaks.
Yeah, I'm sad to admit it because I do like David Lynch's films. I have not seen Twin Peaks just yet, but someday.
Yeah.
I've
And
been
so
real.
now,
I've been
a
really.
lot of the
I've been really bad at um movie watching lately, except for stuff that I do for my job because I'm an entertainment reporter at my college's newspaper. So
I mean, a lot of what I like it tends to be left of center, which in a way makes my job easier in that respect because it means that I can be more curative, and I can be more selective. Everybody talks about stuff that's popular and obvious, and in a way, Phil K. Dick has started to kind of fall into that category.
I don't think he'll
It's
ever be like traditionally popular though,
Not
because
really, but
he's so
he's
bizarre and
getting
strange.
easier. He's getting easier to talk about because of the work that has been made from his work.
Mm-hmm.
So the barrier has been lowered.
Mm-hmm.
The same thing can't be said for someone like Stanislaw Lem, I don't think, at least not yet. I don't see his stuff being adapted anytime soon. Actually, no. They did make a movie of his book, The Futurological Congress. The movie was simply called The Congress. And it's a very loose adaptation of the book. And it's actually a really good adaptation because they were doing justice
Is that
to
the
the
one with
spirit of the idea.
what's her name? Damn it, Jenny
Yes.
from Forrest Gump.
Yes.
Her, yes.
And it barely got released, but then it got basically brought back up into movie discussion circles. It got re-released on video, and people are now paying attention to it. And I'm hoping that will in time lead to a bit more attention to Lem in particular. But you know, with someone like Dick, I was always saying to myself, man, it's amazing that he was just everyone considered his work unfilmable, and yet at the same time, he's one of the people are rushing to try and film constantly.
Well, yeah, a lot of his ideas are very you could play with, in a lot of
And I think
ways.
a big part of that is because of the language again of movie making and storytelling, visual storytelling has caught up to the point where we can do this kind of stuff casually, and people won't get thrown off by it. Non-linear storytelling. It's daytime. Sorry, primetime TV does it all the time now. Nobody gets confused by this anymore.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, it's
So
quite
the
amazing
barrier
how
is lower.
it's amazing how we've grown over the years.
No, and it's a good thing too. It means that we become that much more casually sophisticated as a culture, that a lot of the things that would have previously be considered hopelessly pretentious or highbrow are now staples, and that we can build on those, that we can transform them, and it's just easier to do it, because it's everywhere.
Uh, yeah, for sure. I mean, there's yeah, but going back to what my initial point was, like, there's so many other science fiction authors I'd like to try. Ian M. Banks is another one I'd like to try at some point.
Yeah.
Cause a lot of my friends really like the culture and are like, Britton, you should read it, and I'm like, one day I'll try it. A lot of people like consider Flabius, try that or whatever, however you pronounce that, or Phoebius.
I'm bad
Phoebius.
with names too, but I know which one you're referring to. And one of the funniest descriptions I heard of the culture series, as it's called, the Banks books, is basically uh, psychedelic neo hippies in space.
I've heard similar. I've heard like space cowboy hippies, and
Yeah,
I've heard that.
and that
So,
sounds like a very 1970s British SF new wave kind of thing, except he's doing it, sometime after all of that.
though, the one thing I am curious about with that series is how he's going to make a post scarcity world work. Though, I mean, I guess you could say Star Trek kind of did it, but
Right. I mean, a
um,
lot of times what they will do is they'll simply say, "It's happened. Here are the consequences,"
mm,
and then just go right to the next bit of business after that. To answer ask the next set of questions.
yeah, for sure. I mean, it's one type of art to explain things, and another to not, or it's another to show the consequences of them.
Also, to show it as a way of life, and not just as a technical exercise. That was one of the things that I think Star Trek actually got a little bit better at as it went along. Was it became a little bit less about this very highly specific corner of this universe.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little bit like talking about modern society through nothing except the people on a warship.
Mm.
And then it started to broaden and include more and more of the rest of the universe casually in there. And I'm like, that's what I want to see more of, man. You know, I don't just want to be on a starship all the time.
Yeah. I will say you're definitely going to come on State of Science Fiction at some point because I think that would be a great conversation.
Cool. Yeah.
So, well, yeah, that'd be a great chat. Though I've loved this conversation, but I do have to go. I have other things I'd like to do
Same
this
here.
evening.
It's almost 11 o'clock where I am, but I've had a wonderful time.
But I'm glad we managed to get this together because like it
Yes.
was kind of weird because when I first asked you, you kind of gave like mixed signals. You were kind of like, let
Part
me
of
look
that
some
was that I
more
was
into it, and I'll
juggling.
get back to you. And then like the other
Yeah,
day, you
part of
were
it was I
like,
was just juggling so many things going on at that moment.
oh,
And I didn't wanna I have this thing where I really don't like to overcommit
mm-hmm,
if I can help it because I'm become really sensitive about my time management. I
mm-hmm.
found that it's actually one of the best things for my mental health is to not say yes to everything that comes my way.
That's
But
fair.
the
Yeah,
more
that's
I looked
fair.
into what you're doing, I said, "Okay, this actually seems really interesting. I should get back to this guy and
Um,
nail things down."
um. Well, I'm glad I proved worthy of your time. I'll say
Yeah,
that.
same here. I hope I passed the audition, as the
Um,
Beatles said after their last performance.
um, but as I like to do before this is over, if you have any social media you'd like to share, feel free. Be
I don't
shameless.
keep much of a social media presence these days except for my blog, which
Mm,
is just infinimata.com. That's where I have most of my um, social media stuff to begin with. I have a Twitter account,
nice.
but it's just basically echoing things that are posted to the blog. I don't really read Twitter very much, if at all. Um, I haven't really branched out into any of the other social media stuff that's going on. I don't have a Facebook account anymore. And a big part of that is just because there's only so much time that I can devote to that before it just becomes a net negative. And I have a day job, which does take up a fair amount of my time and energy and resources. And so the time that I have left over, I want to devote to my writing, to my family. And the curation of social media is a very, very insignificant slice of that.
So like,
But I do have the video channel,
well, I
and
was
that's
about
that's turning into something pretty fruitful.
so to sum things up, mainly go to your blog or
Mhm.
website
And everything else can and of course, the YouTube channel,
and
which
the
you
YouTube
can link.
channel. Yes.
That's easy. But yeah,
Um.
those are the 2 big outlets at this point.
But yeah, thanks for coming on. This was a lot of fun. This was great. We should do this
Thank
again
you so
at some
much for
point.
having me. I'm looking forward to, making another appearance later on your other channel when time permits.
All right. Yeah. Let's do this again. And until next time.